First of all, this is not me like trying to show off or overpower you with a proof where it's like me fighting you in some way and I'm bragging that I can like overpower your mind with the power of mine. You will definitely win if you can easily, someone can easily, it's not about convincing you at all, basically, or impressing you. I'm trying to show you how to understand and build, and like I talked about previously in alchemy, the results, the fruit, the understanding, or the final answers fill themselves in as you attend to the foundation. So I'll be building up with you now, and then the full understanding or the great clarity may fill itself in on this webinar. It may fill itself in during tonight, and you work on things, or over the week, or in 2 years, or next week, whatever. So we kind of have an experience of proofs like in geometry in school, right, where there's like a set of axioms, and it's not going to be that. There will also be very significant differences in what I'll say than things like the first cause argument or things that Aquinas said, but there'll be maybe a similarity here or there, or something that superficially might be similar. Okay, so it's not about dazzling you or convincing you or winning a debate. My strength and what or my contribution or whatever, where I focus is generally what makes someone a guru or a pastor or whatever is ultimately like their presentation. And we're stuck with me because what I'm good at is figuring this stuff out. And so both you and I are stuck with me trying to explain this as best I can until someone better comes along to explain it better. Okay. And just around this slide out, if I give a mixing paint illustration, if I say to you, oh, I have this great shade of blue paint, and you say, oh, great, let me see it, put it in my can over here, and if you have a bunch of paint already in that bucket, let's say it's brown because it's been a bunch of colors mixed around, and then I put my blue paint in there, then you'll be like, where's the blue paint? It looks brown to me, right? So if we're not going to, I'm going to be, and like I talked about with the local peak metaphor last week, I'm going to be looking to get us in a different understanding of the world and a different foundation. So this isn't going to be something that we can quickly build on top of your existing understanding or knowledge or foundation. And in general, you can't know something unless you're willing to open up the question about it one way or the other. So wherever you stand, whatever your sense of belief, remember also I talked about how it's a contradiction in terms to believe that something is true. You can believe as if something is true, meaning you can act on the idea of something being true. You can stipulate, but you don't stipulate that something is true. To stipulate is to state, all right, I'm going to suppose that I have, let's say, $5,000 of startup money, and then let's see what I can do with that in a business plan, right? Then you're stipulating that. You're not asserting it's true or not. You're just stipulating. And similar with assuming. We're not going to need to assume anything's true in this discussion. And in general in your life, you actually can go through all of your life, and it's much, much, much better to, without opining or assuming that something is true. Again, you can act on things and think about what you're going to do. You don't need to judge, but you can also know certain things are true, and that's different, but that takes a method. I'm not going to get into the method of how to know what's true here, but I'll be using it, as always. Okay, let us continue here and see what the next slide says. So it's a little bit of a surprise. Don't have it all perfectly memorized. Okay, so this is going to be an interesting one here. What generally happens when people deal with the issue of God, and if people try to talk about or prove or convince or believe that God exists, they start actually by giving away the ball game or in the wrong way, and then try to go from there. And an atheist who's quite good at philosophy and thinking can take the usual premise we start with and generally show how most all of theism or most all of their arguments or Christianity or pretty much any other religion, and how it's mostly bunk, starting in the wrong starting place. And in people's religion, a lot of it's created on top of what's true, and so a lot of it is bunk anyway. So there's that. But here's what exists in existence. And I haven't said this in this way before ever, so this is a little bit new, but it's a great way to put it, I believe. There are in existence conscious entities. There are consciousness fields. That's that which conscious beings like you and myself, and will come to see God, are aware of. That's whatever we're aware of. Our knowledge, by the way, we don't have perfect reflective knowledge of everything that we're aware of, because a lot of it just kind of goes in one eye and out the other, in one ear and out the other. Just like if we're right now, I can look out my window into my lawn of grass, and in one sense, I'm aware of the whole lawn, but I don't have reflexive knowledge of that. I'm not aware of every blade in a certain way, but in another way, I do see the whole lawn. Anyhow, within our consciousness field, though, is our only foothold, and somewhere in there is our foothold for knowing and knowledge and understanding. Has to be there. Can't be somewhere else, because that's all that we're aware of. It by definition, by construction, is our consciousness field. So consciousness field, I've explained this several different places, but just to review, because this is the basis. This is such an important basis. This distinction about your consciousness field and my consciousness field and all of our consciousness fields. This idea, this dividing line and distinction is what got me started in a whole different place than where everyone else is. And it's not that I wanted to be in a different place or not, but on the other hand, I did realize that the game had to get changed, because as life is, there's just very deep assumptions about how the world is where we can't win. We're just kind of screwed all the time. Like, we can be happy and we can feel successful, but there's a way in which it's like never complete, right? And then we believe that either people believe that we die and that's it, or people believe that we die and we go to a better place. But then that's a little weird, because if we die and go to a better place, why not just kill ourselves right now? And then people try to think, well, okay, but you shouldn't kill yourself, but you go to a better place. Or some people think some people go to a better place, some people don't. And then they don't imagine themselves in that better place doing anything and everything they can to figure out how to get everyone else in there, right? They don't. They just imagine just sitting around being happy, which doesn't make sense, right? Then we have a worldview again where we give up the ball game. Some people are going to be happy, some aren't, and we give up. That's it. Great. We just try to be like good people, or have a relationship with God, or accept God, or I don't know. I guess some people believe that if you murder enough people, you get 73 raisins or 73 virgins, depending on what the thing is. But this idea that some people can ultimately be happy and some won't be is also helpless, right? Like, that's grounded in helplessness, that we're satisfied with a lack of total good. And if we're satisfied with a lack of complete goodness, we don't actually have to be unsatisfied. We can be thankful for all the goodness we have right now. But if ultimately our final plan in life is that some people are going to be super happy and some aren't, then there's a helplessness to that, and there's a ridiculousness to that. Come on, isn't it? The only thing worthwhile going for, unless someone has such a clear knowledge and can prove in a very clear way that some people just have to be unhappy. But I think I can show the opposite, actually. It makes no sense that on an ongoing way people would be suffering without any hope of getting out of that. It's basically nonsense as far as I can tell, understanding how God is. All right, so our consciousness field, I was saying that this distinction is what got me in a totally different playing field than normal, and we need it. We need a different playing field, because again, I just kind of gave a little spiel on why the playing field that we're on, we can't win, and it's like we admit it. It's like our goals are less than great happiness for everyone, unless perhaps you've heard me talk about it, and maybe you came, of course, about it yourself. I never think that the only way to come to these answers is because of me, but just whenever I look at any someone else trying to give answers, it never ends up what I'm talking about, right? It's always something dumbed down and contains various errors. So a consciousness field is everything that you, as a conscious being, are aware of, right? If you didn't have a consciousness field, the opposite would be you're aware of absolutely nothing whatsoever. That isn't the case, right? So you're aware of something, and that something, that's your consciousness field. We know it's there because the opposite of it being there is ridiculous. You can't act on it. You can't even contemplate or think about not having a conscious field at all, consciousness field. And so you have one. And somewhere your consciousness field encompasses everything you're aware of, whether you might think of them as memories, thoughts in your head, mental images, or externally what you're hearing, what you're seeing around you, if you look at the moon, which you think of as very far away, as our model, right, for the universe, and of course in one sense there's a correctness to the idea that the moon is far away, but also the moon is also, if you're looking at it, some visual experience that you that you think of as the moon, that's right there in your consciousness field. So even if it's far away or nearby or out there in the world or in your head, if you're aware of it, then that's your consciousness field. Given that there's a consciousness field, then there is something that's aware of the consciousness field. In my way of understanding the world, you build everything based on, you build your knowledge, your understanding of the world based on starting with consciousness fields, rather than starting, what people normally do is they'll start with the idea of a physical world. That's the basis for reality. Then they'll suppose that minds or consciousness just arose out of the physical world one day or somehow. And it's like magic. But ultimately thinking that way is like thinking, well, how many oranges or how many grapes does it take to make anything, an iPhone or iMac or MacBook, whatever they're called these days. I don't have one. But if someone, you can understand, it would be impossible to act on the idea that, oh yeah, maybe iPhones are made out of grapes, right? Like the fruit. If someone was going to be stubborn and tell you, well, prove that they're not made out of grapes, prove that iPhones, then you might be a little bit tongue-tied, but you understand they're not. And similarly, if you stack up a bunch of protons, neutrons, electrons, and forces like gravity and so forth, and think that you're going to get consciousness by stacking those in a certain way or organizing those in a certain way or having them bounce around in a certain way, it's just nonsensical. I'll look to explain that better and better, but again, it's like if someone watches the Flintstones, and in the Flintstones, their gadgets have little animals in them to make them work, right? Right, like the prehistoric show, right? Fred Flintstone and so forth. If someone thought that's how their computer worked, and then you opened it up and showed them the motherboard and computer chips and so forth and the wiring, and then they still thought that, or they told you, well, prove that it's not run by animals. You say, well, I showed you how it did work, but it's kind of hard to disprove every crazy thing that someone comes up with. But the idea that you get consciousness out of a bunch of balls bouncing around and supposed forces working on them and so forth is just basically as weird as thinking that you can, how many grapes do you combine together to get an iPhone? Okay, so the other thing that existence consists of is reasons. Now, this is interesting because this is where we're going to stick the code that I've called in the past, or what we think of as the physical world, doesn't exist at all in the way that we think. And it's starting by thinking of the physical world incorrectly is kind of the basis for existence. Like atheists will essentially argue that why can't matter be self-existent and forces and so forth. But the correct understanding of the world is that there's your consciousness field, and you start there. And when you start to build from there, then you can start to ask, well, what's the reason why I experience what I do rather than something else? And then also, what's the reason why my consciousness field changes? So when we ask the question in that way, then all the rest of the world, we'll end up building a model of our mind and the physical world or whatever, any of that, gets constructed as reasons why we experience what we experience, but nothing else. A couple of illustrations that are a little bit similar to this. It's not perfect because anything you do kind of within the model of the world is not going to be a perfect illustration of what I'm saying, but I can give a couple of things that kind of help show how what I'm saying is something we're actually more familiar with than we might realize. If we think of like Middle-earth, right, from J.R.R. Tolkien, from The Lord of the Rings, then we can speak coherently about Middle-earth. there's a way that Middle-earth can be thought of to exist in a certain way, but we also don't think of it as an actual place that we can go visit, or not just that we can't visit it, but in no way is it hard, in no way is it made up of actual electrons and protons and forces. And yet, a lot of happenings within Middle-earth, either from the movie or from the book, the trilogy or more, and from the book, then they could be explained coherently on the basis of electrons and normal forces plus magic, right? But even magic in that world and in other worlds, in other fictional worlds, follows some sort of its own physics typically, right? An explanation. So putting magic aside, just because it's an unnecessary complication, if we think of Middle-earth, we can explain it also in terms, or happenings there in terms of forces and molecules and electrons, but we don't believe that those molecules, electrons, light waves, and so forth, that actually exist anywhere or in any way, shape, or form. They only exist as reasons why things happen in the book or things happen in the movie, right? So that's interesting. Another way I've used a metaphor with computers, right, where computers consist of what's on the screen, and then we can think of it, and then there's reasons why you have what's on the screen and what isn't on the screen, right? There, if you this is most easy to see with where if the computer is running a video game that takes place in a supposed place, right? Like if there's a city, like let's say the video game takes place in something like New York City, maybe a fictional version. We have monsters in the sewers, and you run down there sometimes, you run into buildings, and sometimes you're running out in the streets of New York. Nowhere does that physical world actually exist, right? The world that you're simulating in the computer game. And yet you can speak about it coherently. If you're playing with your friends, you can speak about it coherently. You can that world exists as reasons why what happens in the game happens. And when you run down a certain hallway in the game, or sewer, line or whatever in the game, then there's a reason why you see what you see and you don't see something else, and why the corridor turns one way and not the other. And that reason is encoded within part of the code for the game, right? And then it mixes with things happening right now in the game. Like there's the code for the game, then there's kind of what's going on in the game right now that's mixed with that, and then that gets mixed with other stuff, and you have what the pixels light up on the screen. That simulates, or that kind of is parallel much more to the way the world actually works than, because what you think of as the actual real physical world is ultimately the same. I've referred to it as code if you want, but ultimately it exists as reasons. It doesn't exist as something hard and physical. And actually, if you ever try to pin down the physical world, it keeps squirming away from you. So that can be an indication that can help you to be suspicious. Motion doesn't exist. And what's interesting is if you have a motion picture, right, it looks like there's motion. If you have a motion picture of a car driving down the street, you have the experience that feels like, your brain makes it feel to you like there's a car actually moving continuously through space and moving down the street. But if you try to pin that down and look at what's going on underneath it, you're never going to get to the motion. Whenever you dig, you end up getting, with a motion picture, you get to still frames, right? These days, I think the way video works is there's keyframes where they're like still frames, and then there's instructions or vectors or whatever on how things move off of that. As far as I know, I don't do any kind of coding. So, but there's something along that concept, something similar, fundamentally similar to a motion picture is still what's going to happen with a modern video. If you try to pin it down, you're always going to get to discrete mixing of information modifying itself and being processed, mixing with the computer processing and so forth, and then showing up as pixels on the screen. And nowhere, anywhere is there motion, but you experience it in video. But then you figure, oh, well, that's video, but in real life there really is motion, and there really are forces. Literally, forces don't exist except as reasons. They don't exist as things that can cause things. The way existence actually works is that actually the only thing whatsoever that can be a cause of anything, and remember, everything, the basis for everything, in a sense, is your consciousness field. So when we're talking about causing, we're really talking about causing changes in consciousness fields, yours and whoever else is conscious. That's where everything takes place. That's like again, there's reasons why you experience what you experience, and then there's your experience, and then there's everyone else's experience, and there's the reasons why that exists. There's going to turn out to have to be just one and only one entity that can cause any changes in any consciousness field. But then there's reasons. Within the reasons why this entity causes what it causes and not something else, that's where all the interesting stuff goes on. That's where our models come into play. And so the model that we have of the physical world, it works a lot. Interestingly enough, it also doesn't work a lot. Right? If we had a good enough model, or a truly good, and actually truly good and good enough are logically identical. There's the idea that something would contain some bad and not be, the idea that a situation or something would contain some bad and still be good enough is a contradiction in terms, unless you are dealing with a thresholdish thing, like you have to get over a certain amount of something. But in that case, you still end up back to where you have good and not bad if you need a certain amount of stuff to get over a bound, an obstacle or a threshold. Then you're still good. There's one good, and that's getting over the threshold. That's how you've defined it. And if you get there, then that would be the sensible idea of good enough, is you're getting over a threshold. But if you're getting over it with bad, then that isn't good enough in the sense. You can, again, be fully thankful and appreciative of what you have at any time, but you don't want to think of it in terms of good enough unless there's no bad left, until we've resolved all the contradictions and dissolved all the bad. Okay, so the physical world exists as a reason. It doesn't exist in and of itself. Once we understand it that way, then the world will keep making sense, ultimately. At first, it can be confusing to try to think of the world entirely differently that way. But the world as you're used to thinking of it, as the physical world is kind of self-existent, and the cause and the reason for things, it keeps not making sense when you start to think of, well, what causes what? What's a cause? What's a reason? I would get a little bit too much in a tangent if I started to delve into that a lot. But presumably I'll loop back around or get to examples of that as I continue. But I'll just leave it at, as people understand the world, the physical world that way, answers are constantly elusive. And people think that we fight, try to think if this is relevant, people think that we fight over, like, religion. Like, I just came to this thought because when I talk about elusive answers, right? People are just constantly fighting, right, over when to use violence, when it's okay to violate property rights, or what can magically make violating property rights okay. There are times when violating property rights could be okay if you're trying to remedy a property rights violation and you're operating on the specific individual who caused the violation. You're trying to remedy it or protect against a direct, violation, and then that could do it. But people try to invent all sorts of other ways to violate people's property because they want what other people have, right? Or they want people to do what they want. So that's what people ultimately fight over, is supposed magic wands to violate property rights. Sometimes those can take the guise of religion, right? Where we can hurt people or condemn people or ostracize people, hurt their reputation, which can be a property rights violation, where they kind of have lesser rights than other people and so forth, based on these rules that are magically moral or again, magically give us an excuse to hurt somebody else. But what I'm talking about here isn't going to cause people to fight. It'll do the opposite. So I'm not justifying religion here. Whenever religion, again, takes the form of morality, which is other than understanding property rights and or love, right, where you're giving of your property and resources to help somebody else. Those are the two places where morality resides, love and property rights. Nowhere else. Everything else ends up being a perverse justification of when the people can violate property rights wrongly, like a magic wand for doing so. Okay, let me continue on, and that'll shed light on what I have here. Let's see if this is where we want to be here. So what I'm trying to do here is this is like, planting a seed and watering it to get the fruit we want. I'm working on our foundation here in order to have the understanding that God exists, like, kind of be built for you. I'm not trying, again, to make a convincing presentation or something that just makes you feel like God exists. Because if I make you just feel really powerfully that God exists, that someone else can come along who's more convincing or more recent, right? Because more recent things feel stronger to us than things in the past. Some other charismatic person can come along and make you feel differently or confuse you out of it. The only way, the reason why I believe I have a credible plan to transform the world into a place that's radically differently good for everyone is based on a method where we can help individuals understand how to know what's true and start to build that, but in a way where they won't go back. And so if our idea of truth and our beliefs, and if we're beliefs understood as believing what is true, if our model for the world and truth and all that, if it's based, normally it's automatically and by default based on what I'm going to call triangulation. And this is a groundbreaking idea. This ultimately can be fascinating for you, right? Of course, I've just started to explain it right now. But if you process this enough, it'll get to where it's earth-shattering. And it also is part of what I started to help people try to see in my previous Alchemy webinar, where I wanted you to see how generally our beliefs about the world and our feelings that our brain gives us, including about motivation and what we want to be doing, and also judgments about other people in certain ways and so forth, it's arbitrary. It's actually triangulated rather than constructed properly. By triangulated, here's what I mean. People say, oh, I don't just believe something because an authority figure says so, or because my pastor said so, or because of one experience. That when people see someone seeming to believe something based on one input, then we feel like that person is naive and easily swayed and being silly. But what we all do instead is we're satisfied instead with triangulation. Roughly 3 reasons. Like if we feel like it's true, we have an experience that corresponds to something being true, and then if we hear it from an authority figure, at that point we'll feel like, yeah, absolutely it's true. So at some point we'll have a few angles, roughly 3, and our brain does this. And at that point it's reinforced to the point where it feels true. And so, but it doesn't have to be based on anything that's actually true. It's just, as I said, like one authority figure or a couple of authority figures all say so. We're like, okay, got it, it's true, right? And if it fits, truth in this triangulation also is involved with fitting. People hear something, they'll be like, oh yeah, that fits. Well, that terminology indicates triangulation because it's like it fits in with their model of the world. And it fits, like, for something to fit, you don't just attach it to like one end, right? You generally kind of fits into like a little shape, right? And, roughly kind of 3 things. It doesn't have to be exactly 3, but that's a good rule of thumb to understand what I mean, is that people's entire worldview and model of the world and understanding what's true, including about God, is based on triangulation, but not foundationalism. And again, it all happened when you were an infant, and it got built from there, and your brain had to do something to get you going. So we're all given this starter kit, and the problem is we never build something new. God always intended and intends for us to build something that can, over time, either fix or replace our starter kit. Our starter kit being our default view of the world that only got built by triangulation. But in order, as I talked about before, in order to defend ourselves against feeling helpless, we defend our model for the world. Our model for the world in and of itself, for starters, is a defense against feeling helpless, which we're not, but our brain, of course, presumes that we are because it figures that we're our body and itself, our brain. And our body and brain are ultimately helpless. And then the only thing that makes it less helpless is building up more resources, more relationships, people doing what we say, and having, well, basically most everything is built off that. Even money, right, is just to helps people do what we say, and then people feel more powerful. And then people want to defend their belief system. And if we get close to the heart of it, What's interesting is that people defend blurriness. That blurriness is a very important part of people's defense because it all dissolves, it all makes no sense if we look too closely. And so we'll really, our mind and our feelings will really kick up a fuss if we start to open up places that it needs to keep blurry in order to protect our psyche, in order to protect us from feeling helpless. So you can refer back to my previous Alchemy 2 webinar to help even more with that. And I'm going to keep developing that theme because ultimately all of this, one angle of all of this is about us understanding that we're not helpless. We have power. We don't have massive power. We don't have variable power even, as far as I can tell. But the effect of our power will absolutely snowball over time. And as far as I can tell, God's rigged the whole thing. I think God's rigged it so, as I've said before, even one person can spark like a gravitational reaction where other people can then understand properly and free themselves, and then that creates more gravity or more, however you want it. I'm speaking in terms of a model, right? It's not perfect, but a little bit of a metaphor. Or if you imagine that each individual person is kind of overcome by enemies, only metaphorically you can imagine like demons or something. But if any one person could theoretically overcome their own demons, then they could go and, but if other people who are still fighting are going to cause problems for everyone else. But if they go to and try to, now you have, if one person can get out, change the game, then they can help another person. And you can do this, right? You can do this in your life. If you can get out from underneath this defense for the defense, this ultimate feeling of helplessness that you try to overcome by feeling powerful, but by stacking on top, by trying to stack up resources and leverage on top of a feeling of helplessness. We don't want to do that. But if you can get out and change the game and understand, including understanding that God exists and how this game is all rigged in a good way, then now you help someone else who's maybe close, right, or who wants help properly, but who wouldn't do it on their own. But now it's two of you, and now between the two of you, you overcome it. Now you have two people who are free in a certain way. They might not be perfect. They might not have gotten rid of every wrong idea in their mind, but they've gotten a foundation. They've gotten a foothold, whereas generally people have no foothold. They don't even have the foundation. And that's what I see when I read different books and different gurus and different people talking about truth. I see that they don't even have the foundation to start with. They're trying to, they have all sorts of correct ideas and helpful ideas, but everything's trying to be built on the wrong foundation. And so even as they give people helpful ideas, they're reinforcing a fundamentally incorrect foundation, such as that the physical world is the basis for things. And then they try to build an idea of God into that. Like there's the natural and then there's the supernatural. God isn't supernatural, right? In this previous scheme, there's no supernatural. There's conscious entities, there's consciousness fields, and there's reasons why you experience what you experience and other people experience what they experience, and not something else, or not nothing. There's no supernatural. When we think of God as supernatural or ultimately unknowable, and or in some way unknowable, or God's mind is different, we can't understand the mind of God. Some theologians will say, or many will say, they'll ultimately retreat to that if pressed. Oh, you have to take that on faith. What you take on faith is that you can understand. You don't take on faith that you cannot understand. What kind of garbage is that? Oh, I have faith that I can't understand? Give me a freaking break. That's exactly the opposite of faith. Have faith that you can understand God. All right, you can keep on building and understanding. You don't, and if we make everything, we get rid of the bad. We can dissolve contradictions without knowing. I'm not saying we know everything God knows or anything like that, but we can understand enough to dissolve the bad. Bad is unnecessary. All of it is unnecessary. None of it's necessary. None. And we ultimately do have the power to not have bad in the world. And it's by following this model I'm talking about. What's interesting, again, if we refer back to this first slide, what's going to turn out to be interesting is that God is aware of all of our consciousness fields. Whoever we hurt, no matter how justified, God feels that in addition to the person. And so then if we care about God, in a sense, we feel it or we understand that God's hurt, and we don't want that. So we don't want anyone to be hurt. As I've said in other places, we might need someone to be stopped. We always prefer, however, that somebody, we don't really need to worry about that except for kind of as a stable base or to kind of, but the important thing is we want people to understand what's wrong so they can fix it. And if they're doing something terribly hurtful to others, it also hurts them. But we have all of these constructs in life, right? Government being one of them. But even parents teach their kids, don't hurt other people. And they try to base the morality. Most everyone's morality is based on this idea of not hurting other people, in a sense. And so, but the trouble with that is it's so easy to squirm out of. Like, oh, it's not going to hurt someone who has $1 million to pay some money to get extorted. You know, oh, it's not going to hurt them if I do this. It's not going to hurt them if I do that. And then, so that's not a helpful morality. And then I have to try to explain why I'm hurt in order to not have someone take it, or you have to explain why you're hurt in order to not have someone take your property. That doesn't make sense. Now you have to feel hurt in order to not be violated. That doesn't make sense, right? You shouldn't have to feel hurt at all, but still not feel violated, not be violated, not have your property violated. So we don't want to teach our children not to hurt others. We want to teach children about understanding property and not to violate property. Okay, so triangulation is truth. Now, some people have commented, well, I already know that God exists. Well, careful, because if your knowledge is based on this triangulation, not foundational, if you believe, for example, that the physical world has its own self-existence or was created by God and then just exists, it's not the case. The physical world only exists as a reason, like as a model, as a reason why you experience what you experience. Physical laws are the regularities with which God does things, just like in a computer game. They don't have their own power to do stuff. Physical laws can't do stuff on their own. Physical laws are just a regularity of God doing stuff. But God has to keep them consistent. God can't act whimsically, as I'll get to on a different slide. But God can't just do it. God can't do stuff for no reason either. Right? So God has reasons, and so God just can't be whimsical. God can't just heal one person because he feels like it. Right? I use the masculine for God just because whatever in our language you use is kind of you can't win, right? So good, close enough. Of course, it's metaphorical, and hardly even that, but whatever. Okay. So I mentioned universe, not foundational. By universe, I mean the idea of the physical world. It's not foundational. However, I've thought about it before this webinar. If I try to start explaining this or proving it, I get into I'll get into a little bit of a morass. And you could say, well, hey, Dave, if you can't explain it, how do you know it's right? In order to understand that something's true, it isn't necessarily necessary to be able to explain away every incorrect idea in a way that makes sense to people. I may be able to, even on this webinar, to explain this well, but I also may not, so we'll see. And one thing that pops to mind, if someone says, well, someone looks at a motion picture and I show them that, look, it's just a bunch of slides, motion pictures are just a bunch of slides shown at a certain speed, where if you do it at a certain speed, or if you do slow enough the slides of a car moving, then like the individual film pieces, whatever, then you won't experience motion. But if you show them fast enough, then it feels like the car's moving, right? If someone still, after you show them that, if they say, yeah, well, prove the car's not moving, then you yourself might be a little speechless. Like, well, I'm showing you how it actually works, and now you're saying to me, prove the car, isn't actually moving. You might be able to come up with something, but again, you could kind of feel how you would just feel kind of tongue-tied at that point. And much like how do you put together grapes in order to get an iPhone? People can just keep coming up with ridiculous things and forcing you to explain them away. But that's not, you can see that could happen infinitely. So the way to understand that something's true can't be to explain away every ridiculous alternative. And not in every case. Does something have to be foundational? Okay, so here we get to some of the good part here. All right. So again, it's kind of going to be counterintuitive possibly for a while, or maybe with my other things that I've recorded at different places, you develop the habit of seeing the world this way. But if we just start by thinking in terms of our consciousness field, then, excuse me, then we, if we start by thinking in terms of our consciousness field, then that was an emotion, that was a little incipient burp but it took my train of thought away. I didn't get all worked up there. But if we start with our consciousness field, then and then we say what I've said already, which is we think, well, what is the reason? Or we can ask, does there have to be a reason for everything? So that's the, and if we resolve that, then we're pretty set. There's just a few questions. Weirdly, I don't know. Did I put them on a slide? I might just have them in my notebook. But there are, let me put them on a slide. I'll just put these for your reference. Say, does everything, not everything, but does every instance of your consciousness field, that's the important thing. When people talk about does everything have a cause and so forth, they're starting with thinking of everything in a confused way. That CF stands for consciousness field. Does every instance of your consciousness field need a reason? And then there is, I feel like there's one other thing, infinite amount, well, I'll just say that. Can an infinite amount of anything actually exist? And I might clarify this slightly as I work on it. But if we deal with the reason question, I might take a look at my notebook and see if there's one line that I'm leaving out. But let's just deal with this for now. So if we confront this, then we're going to be all set. If we just have a sense of that not everything in terms of God doesn't need a cause or a reason. And when people think of things as like concepts, again, in the normal way of the world, everything, it's just hard to pin anything down, and that can be an indication that something's off. You think, well, where do concepts exist? Do they exist in our mind? Wait a second, they don't exist only in my mind. Do they exist somewhere else, right? Where does liberty exist? And Plato thought, well, maybe there's a world like of forms, you know, and so forth. Where do memories exist? Where does the future, like, does the future exist? Does the past exist? Those questions have answers when you understand that there's three things. There's there's reasons, there's conscious fields, and there's conscious entities. Once you see the world that way, then things can make sense. When you see the world in the normal default way, then when you try to pin stuff like that down, it keeps squirming away from you. Just like if you try to find where the motion is in a car, in a motion picture, whenever you start to get granular, there's no motion anywhere. So let's deal with just this one issue that is kind of at the bottom of everything, or can resolve everything, or nearly everything. Does there have to be a reason why you experience what you experience and not something else, or not nothing? And the answer needs to be yes, and here's why. Here we can just show how the opposite would be absurd. If anything at all could happen for no reason, then it reduces to everything has to happen for no reason whatsoever, because if only some things happen for no reason in your consciousness field, and some experiences or perceptions, whatever you want to think of them as, some instances in your consciousness field, some configurations of your consciousness field. If some happen for no reason and some configurations of your consciousness field happen for a reason, then there would have to be some sorting mechanism to decide when something would happen for no reason and when something would happen for a reason. And that makes no sense, right? There's like something or something would actually have to be sitting there with the power to cause things and decide things, deciding, all right, well, that's going to happen for no reason. But then there is a reason, right? If something's deciding that particular thing is going to happen for no reason, then that's the reason, right? Like now we have a reason and a cause for that specific instance or experience happening. So it reduces, if anything at all can happen for no reason, then nothing can have a reason. Everywhere you go, once you suppose that anything at all can happen for no reason in your consciousness field, then you end up with an absurdity. Because now as long as it's plausible that something can happen for no reason, I could walk up to someone, punch them in the face, take all their money. And it's not only that I could say I punched them in the face for no reason, I could say your very experience and your experience of your memory of me doing that experience itself is happening for no reason. There's no real me doing that, or maybe there is a real me, but I didn't really take your money, I didn't really punch you in the face. None of that happened. That very experience of your memory of me doing that in and of itself, you're experiencing that for no reason. There's no way you could live that way. Literally, you just have to suppose that everything you're experiencing has no correlation to the next moment or the next. There would be no reason for you to do anything whatsoever. You would have no will, no place for your will, because everything's utter chaos. Everything happens for no reason. So you would have no free will. You'd have no power, nothing. You'd be ultimately and completely helpless. And just like everything you build off of that is more and more and more ridiculousness. So you cannot think based on something ever happening for no reason. You can't act that way. It's just nonsense, nonsense, nonsense. Everywhere you look, everywhere you try to build, everything you try to mix with it ends up with nonsense. So each and every aspect of your experience at all moments has to have a reason. It also, and part of that reason there needs to be some entity, something that is able to make consciousness fields, right? That's cause. The only cause that exists whatsoever, the only meaningful meaning of the idea or word cause is an entity that can make consciousness fields appear at every moment and change and be what they are, can make your consciousness field be what it is right now and right now and right now. And whenever it changes or whenever it's upheld, that it can uphold and change consciousness fields. Now, so let's explore that. Why, David, does there have to be just exactly one entity or cause for this? Well, suppose that two different things could both have the power to make your conscious field get configured in various ways. Now, what if they disagreed? Well, one of them is winning, right? If there's more than one, because you're experiencing what you're experiencing. So one of them made it happen, right? You could say, well, maybe my conscious field is a result of both those guys struggling, or both those whatever things struggling, and the result is like a tug of war, and then the rope ends up where it is. But no, because there needs to be at that point be some referee or something more ultimate that is creating the rules why one happens and one isn't. If another way to look at it, if the sum total of those two entities that are struggling for control of your consciousness field, if the sum total of those two entities is not or is limited in power, you see? So either the sum total of those two entities who are trying to control your consciousness field, and this is going to be true if there's 3 or 4 or however many entities trying to control your consciousness field. If the sum total of those entities is infinite or is not limited, if there's unlimited power given there, then it's going to turn out that only one of those entities actually has unlimited power, in which case the other one has no power to cause in that way. It's going to turn out that you do have power, but not to cause things. You have power that involves the reason to affect the reason why you and other people experience what they experience. So there is a lever point or leverage for your power, but it's going to be involved with reasons rather than cause. There can only be one entity that has the power to finally officiate or cause or make your conscious field happen. There's going to be reasons, and it could be a whole complex set of reasons, including the configuration of the physical world. You say, wait, David, you said the physical world didn't exist. It exists as a reason, just like Middle Earth exists as a reason, or just like the computer in the world in the computer game, it has a configuration it has, and that it exists as a reason for what you see on your screen, and it also exists as a reason for why the ons and offs and the binary code in your computer are in the binary configuration that they're on that place in your disk, right, and so forth. So there's a complex set of reasons that go into why you experience what you experience in your conscious field each instance, right, or now. But there's one cause, and I was explaining why. So if we imagine that there's a bunch of entities vying for power, for causal power over what you experience, then they could be they could be struggling in terms of reasons why this final arbiter makes what it makes into your conscious field. But in terms of having the actual power to make it, I was saying that either the sum total of those two entities that are in this tug of war is unlimited or it's limited, right? If the sum total is unlimited, then as soon as those two entities disagree, you're going to find which one is actually unlimited, which one isn't. You see? Because you can't have two unlimited beings in terms of causal power, or two unlimited entities of any sort, that both have unlimited causal power disagreeing. Right? That's a contradiction in terms, because something happens, and something's determining what happens, and one of them wins. The one that wins is if they contradict, then you'll find out which one's all powerful and which one isn't. And then if if one can beat out the other, and again, if the sum total is unlimited, then the being that wins has to have unlimited power, because I just said the sum total is unlimited. Now let's look at the other alternative. There's only two alternatives. I'm not telling you it has to be unlimited, except that we can eliminate the other alternative, which is the idea of those two things that are having a tug of war. What if those two things in total are limited? If the sum total of those two things that are battling or having a tug of war, if the sum total of both of their causal power is limited, well, to be limited, you need to be limited by something actual. You can't just be limited by nothing. To be limited means to be limited by something. To be limited by nothing, I just said you're unlimited, you see? If nothing limits those two entities, they are unlimited. So to say that they're limited means there has to be something actual limiting them. So now we're back to, well, what if there's the third that's limiting them? Now let's add the third's power to those first two. If the sum total is limited, then there means there must be some other thing limiting them. So we end up where if you take the sum total of all the entities battling it out for control of your consciousness field, if the sum total is limited, then that can't be. Because I just said that all of them together, everything with causal power, if they're all limited, I'm saying here's all the entities with causal power that exist. They're all right here. Okay, logically speaking. If this right here, if all of that is limited, I just contradicted myself because I said all of it, but then I said there has to be something else that has causal power that's doing the limiting or the arbitrating or the judging or whatever. So the sum total of all these potential causal entities cannot all be limited, because then you contradict yourself. So the sum total has to be unlimited. And if the sum total is limited, you end up again with exactly one, not zero, not no entities that are unlimited. That makes no sense. That's like saying nothing, right? Nothing is unlimited. Nothing is God. So there has to be one thing that's God, because if you say, well, can't there be two? You forgot what I just said a few minutes ago. If there's two, either they operate in perfect harmony, in which case, in another sense, they're one, so it doesn't matter, right? So either there's lots of things that are operating in perfect harmony, in which case, again, they're one in very important sense, and that's in the sense that I mean. Or you'll find out real quick which one's limited and which one's unlimited. And if one thing is limited and the other is unlimited, then actually this has no power of that sort at all. Because if you have this unlimited causal being and you have something that's supposedly limited, if it has a chunk of God's, if it has a fiefdom or some place where it has unlimited power, that can only be at the whim of God. You end up in the same, or not the whim, and God can't have whims, but it can only be at the permission of God. So really, God has to allow it at all times. You end up in the same sort of reasoning as the can something happen for no reason type of thing. If anything could happen for no reason, then there would need to, if some things could happen for no reason and not others, you need to have an arbiter that's saying specifically what could happen for no reason. But at that point, you've just contradicted yourself. There's the reason, is the something. The arbiter is saying that exact thing can now happen at this moment for no reason, which in and of itself is a reason, so it's inherently contradictory. Same thing with if we suppose that maybe there's this little sub-entity, this godling or demigod or whatever, God with a lowercase g, can this thing have some power but not total? And then God's power is unlimited, but God gives some power. Well, God would have to specify at each moment what power this thing has, and that in and of itself is God being all-powerful, and this thing actually having no power of that sort. The power that this being and that we have is power to affect the reasons why God does things. But things can't be caused by the wind. Your elbow or your negligence doesn't cause a cup to fall over. Gravity doesn't cause an apple to fall. Gravity can serve as a reason or part of the mix of the reasons why an apple falls, or ultimately why you have an experience of an apple falling, right? And gravity exists as a reason, as a regularity of how God does certain things. You see? Just like Middle Earth can exist as sort of like a reason why Tolkien writes what Tolkien does. In a sense, that's not a perfect metaphor, so if you delve too far into that, then you can find incongruities between the idea of a human doing something and God. But at least it kind of gives a bit of an illustration of what I mean. There's incongruities, but there's also parts of that metaphor that do hold up, so that's why I used it. Okay, so I dealt with infinity and infinite, the idea of being unlimited a bit already. And let me show you how an infinite amount of, it's interesting because I realized when I was doing this, you know what's interesting is that space can't be infinitely divided. There's no, it could be continuously divided, theoretically, but not by you. And it never currently exists as a continuous line or a continuous things like that don't exist. In other words, there aren't currently an infinite number of points between my two hands. And how could that be? Well, there can't ever actually exist an infinite amount of anything. Because it's just a contradiction in terms. If there's an amount, it's not finite. If there's an amount, it is finite. Misspoke there. If it's an amount, it's not infinite. God can't, God's self can't even experience all the whole numbers, 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, on, we would say on to infinity, but all we can do is sort of, I can never actually sit here and name them all. But God can't even do that, interestingly enough, because however many God names, there's more, right? So even God is not actually aware of an infinite amount of stuff. God's mind or God's awareness can keep having things added to it. You see the difference? So God's mind and God's power can be infinite in the sense of being unlimited. So the idea of something being unlimited is okay, is logical. But the idea of an amount of anything actually existing that's simultaneously unlimited, that is not. That's a contradiction in terms. So nothing that by its nature would be unlimited can actually exist in actuality. It can't exist in terms of something that God's conscious of as a reason. It can't exist as something that we're conscious of. So here's something interesting. The past and the future, they're both different, but neither of them exist in the way that we might suppose them to exist. The future doesn't exist at all, except as a concept, like a little bit like the whole numbers. The future is like what happens if you mix stuff. So if I were to mix a couple of paints together, then that would be a mixture. Once I mix them, once I make the mixture, then the mixture's there. Until I make the mixture, that mixture doesn't exist anywhere. If I were to imagine the mixture, then my imagination of that mixture exists. If it doesn't exist in the future, it exists. You see? If I have a bunch of Legos and I dismantle them, then the constructed Legos don't exist anywhere. The past doesn't exist except as it mixes some of the past, some things in the past serve as reasons why we experience what we experience now. In that way, so the past doesn't exist as a place anywhere, or as a thing. There's a way that the past doesn't exist, and there's a way that it aspects of the past mix as reasons to form what we experience now. What we'll experience in the future doesn't yet exist. The future doesn't exist. God's not actually aware of the future. God could dictate what happens in the future. There's no limit to God's power, but God can't do things that refer to nothing. God can't do if I make a nonsense phrase, a married bachelor, right? God can't make one, because that phrase refers to nothing. God can't erase the fact that the past existed in the way that it did. But the past otherwise doesn't exist, right? Like, so if you dismantle a building made of Legos, then this is a reasonable illustration of this concept. You can't dismantle the fact that the Legos were at one point assembled in a certain way, but you can dismantle the fact that they are assembled in a certain way. That a bit illustrates the idea of the past. God doesn't exist outside of time in one sense, because people's idea of time is tied into the idea that the physical world is the basis for things, and it's all nonsense. That's when people think about time, they come up with all these paradoxes and conundrums, is because, once again, every time we try to zero in on things based on people's normal triangulated model of the world as real, like the physical world and so forth, and build off of that, it constantly ends up with confusion and nonsense and paradoxes. And you'll just keep noticing that every time you try. What I've been showing you here resolves all that. Everything I'm talking about here, and I've been aware of this I've developed some extra clarity over time, especially in explaining it, but I've generally been aware of this for a long time, and it keeps being coherent. I keep understanding the world, and the world happens as I expect it to. Of course, I can't predict what everyone's going to do or anything like that. I don't mean that. But just generally, the world keeps making sense, including deep ideas, deep questions, and so forth. They all can be understood in a way that makes sense within this model that I'm giving you. Now, let's talk about God a little bit more in terms of the nature of God. Okay, so God is aware of everything that actually exists. The past does not actually exist, except as it affects what's encoded now, what the reasons are now. The future doesn't exist in that way. So the God isn't aware of the future, as we might think. God can say these things are going to happen in the future and make it happen. But there isn't any future to be aware of. The future ends up when reasons get mixed and turned into consciousness fields. Then those consciousness fields exist, and the previous configuration of the consciousness field no longer exists. The reasons can be stored. The code can be stored in various ways by mixing it and storing it that way, just like you store things by mixing them, right? You store images by what? Mixing them with the server in the cloud, or you're physically in the iPhone, right? It gets mixed. I understand that I'm referring to the traditional model of the world that I'm debunking in one sense, but the model of the world has all sorts of accuracies as a model. If I say that Middle-earth from Lord of the Rings doesn't exist as a place that can actually cause things and so forth, it doesn't mean that we can't coherently refer to Middle-earth in a way that can make sense. Of course, we can discuss the physical world and use the model of the physical world in ways that are coherent and will accurately predict certain things. However, trying to use the understanding of the physical world in the way that people do is foundational. That's where we run into problems. But of course, we can deal with it, walk around in it, make predictions based on it that'll work, and so forth. But by understanding how things are triangulated, then we can also not buy into when our mind is leading us wrong. And that's extremely useful. When our mind makes us feel like, oh, I don't want to get up because I'm tired, you can understand that there's not that doesn't have as much reality to it as it feels. Our mind is going to make us feel like that's much more real than it is. Right? Our mind can make us feel like someone's a jerk because their mind and body got mixed with a scenario, and that's the only situation that we're mixing in terms of our experience with them. And then we're like, oh, that guy's a jerk. Well, that person, the core that got mixed might be problematic, and there might be some bad things about ideas in that person's mind, just like the rest of us. But they might also turn out not to be a jerk in the generalized sense that our mind will extrapolate. Right? So there's another way that this triangulation, this way that our brain comes up with things and makes it feel so real. There's a lot less reality. Once we kind of loosen our idea of reality, in that way it's very useful and can make us more flexible to not buy into things that are obviously false. Okay, so I was going to say the nature of God. So God isn't deceived. How about, and someone might be saying, David, you keep referring to God as if God's aware and conscious and intentional. Yes, God has to be conscious and aware and intentional because we're talking about an entity that causes consciousness fields to be configured in a certain way based on reasons. If we then suppose that that entity has no awareness whatsoever of its own, that we just, again, contradict ourselves. We're saying, right, we need an entity that can intentionally make consciousness fields be the way that they are. If we suppose that it's like this force or non-conscious thing, and then we say, well, it's making our consciousness field be a specific way, there's just no tie-in there. There's no, it doesn't, this non-conscious entity, if we imagine it, there's no, we can't get there. Right? It needs the ability to make things be a certain way in our consciousness field. Obviously, it has to be aware in order to do that. So yeah, God has to be aware, actually aware of everything, all consciousness fields and all reasons and so forth. And because that's the case, God isn't going to be deceived. God wants goodness for all. God also can't do things whimsically. So if God were to heal some people, God would need a reason, right, like kind of miraculously. Then God would need a reason why God healed some people and not others. There could be such reasons, absolutely. But there would have to be a reason still. It couldn't just be a whim on God's part. So there'd have to be something that mirrored physical laws, we can call it spiritual laws, whatever, but they're regularities, they're reasons. And those reasons just can't, again, be, the reasons in and of themselves need to be founded in something, not just a whim. If you look at the reason for the reason, you have to get to a place where it's foundational somehow. You can't just have a justification, but then if you look below that justification, there's nothing there. If you say, oh, the reason is the person has faith, then you need to get a sense of what the heck faith is. And it can't, like, right, if faith itself is kind of blurry, then it's not foundational, right? Something blurry and poorly understood wouldn't be foundational. Trying to think here, I was going to say something. So, all right, so suppose you're God, and you could make everyone just feel totally blissful, where they didn't have any ability to decide things. And you could do that, and then they'd be, in one sense you could do it, and then they'd be blissful. But the minute you gave them the ability to participate in the reasons why we feel a certain way, then you're giving them a certain ability that clearly allows for bad as well. So that's what's going on. And in order to fix that, if God were to start nixing all bad, then we'd be back to this blissful state where people couldn't participate. So if God started fixing things, God would have to basically fix everything. Unless God could come up with a set of rules, laws, akin to physical laws, where as operating within those, people still had free will. And so that's fine. But there'd have to be ultimately a set of laws. And again, the laws themselves don't have power, but the laws function as reasons why God does one thing and not another. But again, those laws would have to be foundational. They couldn't just be whimsical or arbitrary. I don't have an explanation of what all those laws might be, by the way, unfortunately. We can all work on it. But once we understand that's how it has to work, then we can work on it coherently and not just spout BS, basically. And the more people we have working on the question properly and with the proper understanding, the better, right? As you foundationally understand the world properly, including God's existence and all of this, then you can maybe break out. You can understand that you do have power, but it's not about being more and more powerful. It's about using the power we do have. And the point of power isn't to just get our way and accomplish goals. Goals and everything else are in service to us and other people experiencing goodness and not experiencing badness. And if we give up and we say, well, I don't really care if some people outside of my tribe or my family or my whatever my tribe might be, right, or outside of myself. But people don't really, almost nobody is like fully selfish. They generally have some kind of tribe, right, some kind of group that they favor. But if we care less about people outside of our group, then that reinforces the idea of helplessness, which is once we have that root, that seed, it leads to all sorts of bad stuff. Then we need to protect it, and we need to have blurriness in order to protect it, and we have to get upset if people start to dig into our beliefs and so forth. So the only way to not feel helpless is to accurately understand that we want everyone, regardless of our tribe, to be happy. And as a matter of fact, anyone that's hurt or experiences bad, God is aware of that, and God experiences that bad too. So God wants goodness for all. God clearly created a situation where we can participate in getting rid of the bad. But I don't think God made it so that we're helpless in that and that we can't get rid of all bad. I think that any one person, as I said, can set things in motion to get rid of all bad. And I at least don't know that's not the case. If God could do it all by God's self, then God would already do it. God has the power to, but again, if God does it, God has to wipe out our free will in order to do it. So it actually takes us serving as reasons, using our power to serve as a reason. And I've pointed to this before, seeking understanding of what's good, seeking to understand things, goodness better, what leads to goodness better, seeking to understand and dissolve contradictions. So you and I, in a sense, we don't have power that God doesn't have, but we can serve as a reason in a way that God cannot, logically cannot. Right? God hits too hard, so to speak. God can't pull God's punches. We don't have that problem. So again, God's depending on us to do this. And again, if God could do it, God would already do it. So I think that people's idea of heaven or heaven and hell contains flaws, that we just kind of sit around, this idea that we just kind of sit around trying to believe that we're good or trying to actually be good, whatever, or trying to say that, no, God has grace and mercy, and all we need to do is flip some switch, and then we just wait it out. Maybe while we're waiting it out, we try to do some good here and there. But there's an essential helplessness to all that. And there's an essential thing that doesn't really make sense. So regardless, though, of that, clearly seeking understanding of things that are important, and important means having more impact on what's good, right? So seeking understanding of what's important and good, clearly that's going to help no matter what. So instead of worrying about whatever we do, we don't want to throw up our hands, right, and just like say, let's wait out the clock until we go to heaven. At which point, some people go to heaven, some people will go to hell. Maybe we feel satisfied that some people go to hell, which reinforces helplessness and is perverse, right? No matter what somebody does, we want them to, what we don't want is them to keep doing things that hurt themselves and others. Yes, correct. But we ultimately want them to, this word has religious connotations, but it shouldn't, because it's the only word that means what it does, repent. We want them to understand properly and then change. When I talk about how people that have the wrong understanding of government, that it can magically justify or make immoral things moral, I'm not trying to condemn people at all. I have to say it so that we stop. Because it's one of the, by far the most hurtful things that goes on, is all these magic wands about how we can violate people's property and justify it. And generally that's government. Certainly religion is used in that way too. But they boil down to one and the same thing, using violence to, or violating people's property. I'm not saying that religion inherently does this. I'm saying that when it goes wrong is when it involves a violation of someone's property, or saying that, oh, well, this person's immoral, and so we violate them in some way because they've violated morality. If someone is doing something immoral, then ideally we'd want them to understand that. Absolutely. But it doesn't give us an excuse. And the problem is that there's all these little extra immoralities that are just invented. And when we can see, really, that people are inventing this to control other people, right? Never should you feel guilty. What you should do is understand a contradiction that's leading to you doing things that hurt yourselves and others and dissolve it. But none of that needs to involve guilt. So anything that's supposed to lead to guilt or shame, that's absolutely incorrect. Anything that, if you violate someone's property, then someone has the moral right to remedy that. Maybe out of love, they won't, right? When Jesus talked about turning the other cheek for them to hit you again, or give them, if they ask for your shirt, give them more than your shirt. I'm not sure. You're supposed to give them your pants or what, but whatever it might be, that out of love, we can choose other stuff, right? That's one of the additional problems with government, is that it crowds out love, right? We can't help other people. It takes this idea of mostly tax money goes to politically connected people and who are rich because of the political connections. But if we suppose that some of it does go to poor people, then wouldn't it be nice if that could all happen out of love rather than based on extortion, right? If the seed is bad, the foundation is bad, then what grows out of that's going to be bad. You can't get good out of the wrong foundation. You can't get any good out of extorting people. Never. You can pretend you do, but the total end result is not good. Pretty much the main objection people have in practice to God's existence is the main logical objection people have is, well, can't matter and forces just be self-existent and not why does the first cause have to be God? And I did not try to argue that God is the first cause, right? The problem with the first cause argument is it starts by presupposing the physical world and imagining God, and presupposing motion and it gets the idea of cause wrong fundamentally, and that's where it goes wrong. It is correct that if you understand cause and reasons properly, then that is the way that you understand about God. So in that sense, cause and understanding it is the way to prove or understand that God exists. However, the first cause argument and then its refutations by atheists, it all just kind of goes around in circles. And they have correct even refutations of, or they have refutations that kind of at least confuse the issue enough that you kind of can't win once you start in the wrong place. What we did today, we just started in the right place, and that's why this all works. So one objection is, why can't matter and forces just be self-existent all by themselves? Like, why can't the universe be the cause of everything rather than God? Isn't deferring the cause to God just saying, waving your hand and saying, well, the universe didn't cause things, some mysterious, supernatural, all-powerful being caused things. And that's what atheists object to, is just making the mystery even worse in their mind. But once you understand that the universe doesn't exist in the way that they're supposing, then you dissolve that issue. You can always, until you have the right understanding, you can always be confused out of feeling like God exists, right? That's the problem with triangulation. But as you get clarity about the way that I described it, they can't confuse you, because you understand the world in terms of consciousness field, then you're building it properly, and you won't be taken back out. That's why we can make progress. When you can make progress, ideologically and otherwise, but especially ideologically, you can understand this in a way you'll never go back, and therefore you can raise your kids or show your kids this, presumably, in a way that they won't go back, where they won't go to college and go crazy, right? And so, and then we can explain it to other people who are interested, because there are people who genuinely want to know, and those people aren't getting answers that are going to work for them. Or even if they do get answers, then they can be confused back out of it by another charismatic person, right, or another good-sounding argument. What I gave you today is not a good-sounding argument. It's the correct way to understand reality and everything. As you understand it, you can't be confused or otherwise convinced or triangulated out of it. Because you don't base it on triangulation, you base it on building from the right foundation, like your consciousness field and the proper method for knowing, which is built off your consciousness field. Okay, so the other kind of objection has to do, and this is kind of the sort of, I don't know how to describe it, emotional or sort of logical, sort of emotional issue. And I already kind of described this, but what about if God's omnipotent, why does evil exist? And so God's omnipotent in the sense that God can create, is the only entity that can create your consciousness field the way it is, or sorry, at all. But God can't do things against reason and against God's own reasons. And so when you allow for the possibility of free will, which allows for more goodness, see with free will you get to participate in goodness and more, and there's more of it, because you get to love. You can't love if you don't have free will. And again, your leverage for free will has to do with seeking understanding. It has to do with participating in the reasons why your conscious field and others is the way that it is. As you seek to understand what's true and good and important, then you will cause your experience, your conscious field, to have more goodness, definitely. And there's nothing else you can do better than that. So that's kind of, in one sense of understanding, that's all you do. You can set your brain up to be doing all kinds of stuff and your body to do all kinds of tasks. But fundamentally, you're just looking to seek goodness. That leads to you being able to care about other people and make them have more, help them to have more goodness. And that leads to, there's more goodness in existence if you're able to love rather than if you're just in a constant state of bliss. And interestingly enough, one way we could know that is that once we understand that God exists, and once we see that God does not have us in a perpetual state of bliss right now, but instead does give us free will, then obviously it's the right choice, right? So you can build stuff off of God existing and God not being able to be deceived by just seeing how God's doing things. We also see how God is libertarian, right, in a sense. Some people say, oh, God, Jesus would be a socialist. Jesus would just extort people, take possessions from people and just hand it to other people. Or in actual practice, what socialists do is they pocket the money. So believing that, Jesus would distribute it to the elites and take money from poor people and distribute it to rich, politically corrected people in an obfuscated way, right? Somehow every scheme that involves more government and it just ends up with more money and power in the hands of politically connected people. Odd how that happens, right? So if we want goodness, we can't force it on people with violence. Violence might be necessary in some cases to just protect us from being taken out completely, right? I don't have a good answer to that. But I don't condemn someone who uses violence in self-defense. I wouldn't use violence on them, after the fact. And there's all sorts of gray areas where, because it's a gray area, I wouldn't use violence on someone. The fact that something's the law has nothing to do with morality. It's just the law is arbitrary. People that want to believe in the law, that's another example of triangulation. They want to believe in something so they don't feel helpless, and so they believe in government. They worship government. They worship, I say worship, because when you believe that something has the magical power, to make something immoral, moral, or magical power to violate property, then that's like worship, right? Okay, so really the question of evil is I've described it, right? It's fairly simple. If you don't want evil, then seek to understand good, and you'll dissolve evil. But God would hit too hard. God, to eradicate all evil, God would have to basically eradicate all free will, eliminate all the potential for love, and you participating in anything. You would just have to exist in a drug-induced haze, so to speak, metaphorically speaking. So that's what God isn't limited by an entity, but God needs to have a reason for doing anything, and that ends up with all sorts of limitations on God in that sense. All right, we've actually gotten to the slides pretty well. What do I have over here? Let's see what this is. Agnosticism and atheism come down to blurriness about whether things can happen for no reason. If you do dig and dig, you'll find that, again, the worldview of agnostics and atheists just keeps squirming away from you. You can't pin it down. It just ends up in confusion. What I've described here shouldn't end in confusion. It should be pretty clear. It's fairly simple, right? Theists accidentally lose the game before they start. That's what I say when you give away the game by presuming that the physical world has this reality, this independent reality, that it exists in some sort of way where it's actually hard, where there's actually a bunch of balls bouncing around based on forces, and that's the root of things. Then of course, once you start out ridiculous, then the idea of God can become ridiculous as well, because you're starting out ridiculous. Atheist complaint that we must address. Are we subbing in God? Oh, this is a little bit interesting. This is when people, creationists and evolutionists, argue. Then what evolutionists will say is, come on, creationists are just putting in God as this mysterious explanation for things we can't explain yet scientifically. I think it was Richard Dawkins who writes about evolution and argues for atheism. He calls this like the argument from personal incredulity. Like, wow, I can't believe these flowers are so beautiful, so God must have made them, or things are so complex. You don't need to show evidence of design in nature the way that I've explained God, you see. Yes, everything in nature has a reason and therefore design, but we don't need to argue about God by arguing from how it looks like things are designed. Then you get in the weeds. Again, you're losing the game before you start. You get in the weeds with evolutionists arguing about whether your vestigial tailbone or something is evidence of design or not design. And so your consciousness field existing in the first place is all you need to understand that God exists. It doesn't matter how complex nature is or not, or it doesn't matter how screwed up things are. That's totally irrelevant. Evil, things being screwed up, things being chaotic, or things being ordered. You obviously have both in the world, but neither of those is relevant to understanding God. You just need to understand your consciousness field and distinguish build your understanding of the world off of that. And then everything could fall into place in a radically different way. All right, this kind of flowed reasonably well. Perhaps everyone is in a complete confused haze. I have no idea, but at least I think I got through all my slides. It's quite a miracle, an hour and a half. So nifty. Let's go to the phones. Let's look at what people are saying. And I'm in both the NHP and the Project Assimilation group, although one at a time. And let me point out that it makes no sense to believe something because you're such and such, right? Like, you don't believe something because you're a Christian or because you're agnostic or because you're atheist. That's only a description of where you're currently at. If you work on what I've shown you here, everyone should have absolute clarity on theism. I haven't addressed, let me give you in a nutshell about why I believe as if Jesus is God. So, just a kind of quick nutshell version. So I can't know for certain in the way that God has to be the case, no matter what. If you have a consciousness field, then God has to exist in just the way I showed you. this all-powerful causational entity, but that has to do things for reasons, can't be deceived, loves us, cares, experiences our conscience field. That's God. Once we understand that God has to exist, then it becomes a little less ridiculous to imagine that Jesus was God's like avatar or something like that, right? And when I say Jesus is God's avatar, I'm not twisting Christianity when I say that. I'm just representing in a way that I think is a reasonable representation. Anything that you say regarding Jesus and God ends up being metaphorical, right? God's Son is obviously metaphorical, Son of Man, whatever. But obviously Jesus' body wasn't actually God, right? God and you don't have a body, right? You have an avatar yourself. Your body and your brain is an avatar itself, right, for interacting with the world. You are not your body or brain, right? You are that which is experiencing your conscious field, and that's it. So Jesus likewise wasn't God as the conscious entity, right? But there was, with Jesus you have a pretty unique situation, and there's just this cascade of unique things about Jesus that whenever I try to look at someone trying to explain it, they don't even come close. I grew up around a lot of Jewish people. I grew up in the suburbs of New York City, in Westchester, near Scarsdale, and my summer programs I would go to would be like all Jewish and so forth. And I had half my friends were Jewish, so I know a lot of people are Jewish. And so, for example, each and every one of them, they don't have a reason why they don't believe in Jesus. Like they don't believe in Jesus because they're Jewish. And I'm not accusing all Jewish people of this. I'm just saying, in practice, each and every person that I would ask, they didn't have a reason that they didn't believe in Jesus. It would just be, well, I'm Jewish, I don't believe in Jesus. And if you try to boil it down, they're like, well, the disciples stole the body, right? So the story that's actually in the Gospels that was circulated then, where the guards were asleep, and while they're asleep, saw the disciples move a massive stone, didn't wake up, and then the disciples took the body while the guards were asleep, but the guards were so alert in their sleep that they saw the disciples take it. That is actually, to this day, used by people. And there's all sorts of prophecies in the writings. Now, I don't look at the Bible as infallible as some people do, because when you talk about mixing, if the Bible was infallible in a way that it just imprinted on your mind the exact right, all the right truths about life, then you wouldn't have to read it in your own language, right? Because why would you have to interpret it? It would just imprint. You could read it in a foreign language, and it would just imprint on your brain exactly all the right truths. If you're reading it in your own language, then you're obviously mixing it with your own mind and so forth. I don't read into what Jesus was saying as everything was infallible anyway, and certainly the idea that people that came after Jesus, like Paul, who Jesus didn't refer to whatsoever, that Paul would be fully infallible whenever he wrote a letter to a church. And then furthermore, whatever I read into what Paul was writing, that's infallible, basically, right? Because people you don't experience directly what Paul meant. You experience your own mixing of your mind with what Paul wrote. So I don't look at that as infallible. I don't look at my ideas as infallible. I look at it as if I build something properly, then it can be correct and knowably correct, except it's still subject to someone else taking what I built and showing me that, wait a second, David, you made an error in what you built. That's fine. But if they just say, well, you're an idiot, or what about carrots, or some nonsense phrase, then that doesn't it. But if they specifically address what I built and show me that where an error is, then I'm always open to it, no matter how certain or clear I am, right? But the way for someone to correct me would be to give me more clarity, not confuse me, right? Not less. Anyway, there's still, regardless of how you take what we call the New Testament, or I guess the Tanakh or whatever, and the Jewish people would call it, but then it was still written before Jesus was born, and there were all kinds of prophecies in it, like he would ride in Jerusalem on a donkey, that there was the whole event that's recorded in history. It doesn't matter if the event actually happened or not. It was recorded and written and translated to Greek before Jesus was born, saying all sorts of things, right? He'd be from, I think it references Bethlehem, and it just goes on and on with prophecies. And there was an incident where people were in the desert, Israelites, and they were rebelling against God. They were stung by like scorpions or something that was poison was killing them. They came to Moses, said, save us. Moses said, this is in Numbers. Moses said, pray to God, and God said, and again, it doesn't matter how well this actually happened. I'm not telling you because this happened, I believe in Jesus. I'm telling you, regardless, it was recorded in history as having happened. So the story existed before Jesus, no matter what. And then that's where the caduceus, right, the symbol of the medical profession, right, which looks like a cross, right, a snake. As the story goes, God told Moses to make an image of or a replica of a snake, put it on a crossbars, or just like, again, the symbol of the medical profession, caduceus. And then when people look to that, then the poison from the snakes, or it might have been scorpions or snakes or whatever, the vermin, I think it was snakes, from what I remember. So the snakes were biting people and it was killing them. And then they looked to the snake on this cross, and the poison wouldn't kill them anymore. I mean, there's a prophecy for you, right, about what happened with Jesus. So it's just nonstop. There's dozens or hundreds, and these aren't things that are fulfilled in other people, right? Most of us haven't ridden into Jerusalem on a donkey or even a foal, I think it was, right, like a donkey kid, like a young donkey. And not from certain tribes. They had to be from certain tribes of Israelites, which wouldn't even be possible later on, and just all sorts of things like that. Then you have a guy who fulfilled all those things and then is recorded in history as having done all these miracles. And you could say, well, they were just saying that. That didn't really happen. They were just gullible. Sure, but you still have a person who... no one's saying that I'm healing people right and left, right, and about you, and about most everyone in history. No one said that about Julius Caesar. So one way or the other, you have a guy fulfilling all these other prophecies, plus there's all these reports that Jesus was healing people, plus based on the fact he was claiming to be God, is the only reason given that he was killed, right? And I don't know there's any alternative history to that. And then you have all these people, disowning him, the disciples go into hiding, but then for some reason they all turn it around and go nuts and even die, right? Not for a cause, but actually they die for a truth, right? For a story that they would have no motivation for upholding if they didn't think it was true. So you have 12 people or 11 that simultaneously all came to the conclusion it was true, all died for it. Not one person to save their lives. Not one of the 11 recanted of this, what would have been otherwise a known lie. And Jesus appeared to more than the disciples. There were hundreds of other people. And the alternative explanations of this are all just very simplistic. Again, they really are like, well, maybe the disciples moved the body, or maybe this was made up, or maybe that was made up, and they explain away one tiny aspect of the story, but then there's all these other things that weren't explained. Even the fact that the story says that Jesus first appeared after Jesus was resurrected, according to the story, he appeared to women. If you were making it up, that would be ridiculous. In that day and age, women weren't even allowed to testify in court because their testimony wasn't considered reliable. And yet they wrote out of the story that Jesus appeared to women first. So, I mean, again, all these things add up to where it's far more reasonable. And then if you look at most importantly, if you look at Jesus' actual statements, they're just extraordinary. I mean, Jesus is the only person I've seen that whose statements just fundamentally are in line with the stuff I am trying to understand, that I understand about the world based on starting with the consciousness field, and that need to be true. I don't understand how to exactly what Jesus meant about a whole number of things, but his teachings are just extraordinary and way out of the box. I mean, who the heck expected Jesus to say, he was saying, I'm going to be like captured, and put on trial. And Peter says to Jesus, no way, God, well, let's protect you. And who would think, in the absence of already knowing what Jesus said, who would think he would say, get behind me, Satan, right? I mean, that's crazy. He's just constantly out of the box. Or one of my favorite lines, very possibly my very favorite, is people were saying, let's go follow Jesus. I want to follow you, but my parents died. I'm just going to go bury them. Or my dad died. I'm just going to go to his funeral. And Jesus, we would all think like, oh, Jesus would say, oh, absolutely, I understand. Go to the funeral. Instead, Jesus said, let the dead bury their own dead, and come and follow me and have life. And that's just out of the box. Who would think that? So he was so ruthless. I mean, just awesome. So the ruthlessness and everything. So I don't have, no. Do I have an absolute proof? No. I do assert that you can absolutely understand that God exists in the way that I showed you, but you put all that together, and then you look at people's alternative explanations are just nonsense and hand-waving. And then you look at what Jesus said, it's extraordinary. And if you even compare what Jesus said to like people that wrote after him later, including Paul, a lot of the things that cause problems, as far as I can tell, they come more from Paul, or totally from Paul. So Paul might have been an incredible guy. I just don't see how you get to where Paul is necessarily infallible. I don't get to see where you'd think Jesus would have mentioned something, like giving us a wink or a hint or something at least. Like, all right, there's going to be an infallible guy. It's going to come after me. You know. So that gives me a sense of what I mean by I'm a Christian. Is I believe as if Jesus was God, and a lot of what really helped me was reading what Jesus wrote and trying to make sense of it, trying to let it break. Jesus said things in order to break you out of the box, and instead people, without realizing it, try to understand Jesus by keeping him in the same box. We also discovered. So if you let Jesus break your mind, blow your mind, instead of trying to fit what Jesus is saying inside of, like trying to, like stick Jesus on the same mountain you're already on, right? That it's pretty mind-breaking, the stuff that he says. It's just extraordinary. So try to make sense of it, and it's what helped break me through a lot of these things. And I still don't claim at all. Can't walk up to a mountain and throw it into the sea, or do various things, but still trying to understand what Jesus meant when he said, if you have the faith of a mustard seed, or if you have enough faith, then you can say to a mountain, throw yourself into the sea, and it'll be done for you. Interesting phrase too. Not that it'll happen, but that it'll be done for you. It's interesting too. You are welcome. Okay, let me go over to the assimilation group. This is awesome. Thank you for sharing this philosophy. I'm agnostic theist. I believe in God, but cautious with religion. Yeah, great. And of course be cautious with, there's all sorts of stuff that's kind of built off of the right foundation, but it's just a construct on top of it. And so you should be cautious with all of your ideas, including ones you feel absolutely certain of, and construct them properly, right? I'm awesome. Again, well, that's great. Nothing wrong with being awesome. Those friggin' apples keep popping. When I was talking about building an apple out of grapes. Probably just people are in a bit of a stunned silence after I explained we've kept pretty much everyone, with plenty of people, nearly 200 on the webinar. Why couldn't consciousness be related to quantum entanglement? You really want consciousness to be primary, and you don't want something where it's an emergent property, but what you can do is you can understand the reasons why you're conscious why you're conscious of what you are, and that's why understanding the physical laws and how the physical world works is very useful and interesting. But it would be you switch the cart on the horse. You can understand, by understanding quantum entanglement or quantum physics, you can understand more about your leverage in the world and how something that you do consciously interacts with your mind, right? Causes one neuron to fire instead of the other, and so forth, and that could be related to tiny differences in quantum fluctuations and so forth. And I've read stuff on that. I find it to be fascinating. But start with your consciousness field. You don't want to start with confusion and build from there. And you also just need to understand the world based on your consciousness field. That is your foundation. Is that what you're directly aware of? There can't be some other foundation for your understanding and knowledge. And I can testify to you also that for decades, building things that way has constantly borne the right fruit, and things make sense. I got an email today from someone asking David Mills and I how to explain just how we've gained success. This here is at the heart of it, right? And yeah, this is absolutely why we wanted to build OMG and all this, is we needed to spread this, Mike and myself. And Mike had the thought at an early age, what if someone comes up with a really great idea or cures cancer or whatever, that person might just be drowned out or be shouted down or be swatted down, and I want to build myself up to be able to help a person like that. That was he thought that when he was like very young. And then he ran into me and he felt like we could team up, and we have, and get this stuff out there. And it's nice also to just have a financial foundation for myself, as well. But then I figured it might as well be in the internet marketing. Did you know that Mike and I, and me in one sense, and then separately Mike and myself, and certainly Mike when he was little, we wanted to, because Mike wanted to like publish and broadcast like some great idea when he was very young. We both had these thoughts before the internet came about. So that's kind of cool, right? I had this plan to spread these ideas to the world, and there was no internet, and then the internet came around. So from my perspective, looking at it that way, it's pretty amazing, right? It's pretty fortuitous, and certainly looks like a path is being laid out. I think I've just blown everyone's mind is too blown to even have questions. This is great. Do I need to refresh? Let me see if I have to refresh. Dave Keys was saying something to me in the question box. Let's take a look. Someone might have a message for me too, but okay, I'll refresh. Now we might be good. I mean, we're good regardless, but sorry about that if I was. Great, yeah. Dave was trying to tell me he got some stuff here. Okay, and let me see if what that did here. But I'll come back. Oh yeah, sorry guys, good. Okay, I'll keep remembering to refresh. Okay, let's see what we got. How does prayer work and what makes it effective? I don't know exactly. I do pray. Some prayers that I think were particularly helpful for me was praying for God to give me wisdom. What was missing? You might have heard me say this before. I would say, "What am I missing, God? What am I missing?" Right? I'm trying to break further and further out of whatever it was. Like I knew I didn't have it, and I was trying to break out. So what am I missing? And then I pray anytime I think of it, roughly each day, God, your will be done no matter what. Whatever it takes, whatever that means, your will be done. Because that must be the best, right? Best thing. And you could say, well, or wouldn't God's will be done, automatically? Like, it's not the end of it. Like, you don't want to, like, pray for God's will to be done and then just do anything you want, right? Or pray for an answer and then whatever answer comes to you when you're in the shower, feel like that's got to be it. You really got to watch that. You still want to have a method that you do yourself for checking things. But that's the example. My wife, it seems like some people have, but I don't know this better than anyone else, but it seems like except that I know God exists for absolute certain, which really is different than just trying to believe it and having it be kind of blurry. But when my wife prays for healing for people, it seems to be surprisingly effective. And what I do, it doesn't seem to be all that effective. Take for that what you will. Perhaps people have certain gifts, just like some people are stronger or are intelligent in different ways. But it isn't like, she can just pray for this person, zap, pray for that person, zap, right? So there's still some kind of effort or sacrifice, but I don't know how spiritual laws work to the extent there are some, and I am interested in it, and I'd like it if people could help figure it out. But the trouble is when people are currently thinking about it, they don't have the right foundation, so they're not thinking in the right place, and so their conclusions are ultimately tainted. The second talk in this series is interesting as a speaker. Oh, this series, I see. Jesus, okay. And this post will be there so people can see. Not only fulfilled basic scriptural prophecies, but even ones that were added later as traditions of the elders that were even tighter and more specific. Yeah, very cool. Yeah, it's really shocking, right? You don't have to believe that the New Testament is correct or not. And I try to, if it sounds like I'm being heretical here or something, I try to have a foundation and a way of relating about Christianity and about God's existence that can apply to everyone, that has the least number of things that people have to accept before they believe, before they come to understand that God is true. So it's not so much that I'm a heretic as I just don't want to create these preconditions or these kind of magical things like, oh, you have to believe the New Testament or the Old Testament is all true in every way, right? And that just leads to all kinds of confusions and difficulties that are just ultimately unnecessary. in a sense. And then if people can then build from there how things are, certain things are all that's true, then great. But you kind of make it a little bit too ridiculously easy for atheists or to just shoot your arguments down when you kind of try to blend some weak ones in with certain ones. And sometimes Christians will make the mistake of just kind of waving their hand and saying, "Oh, people are hard-hearted," or they don't. Their hearts are hard. That's why they don't believe. When people just don't have triangulation going for them. I've really seen people and experienced actual people where they do want to know, and the answers they were getting were just kind of ridiculous, and so they couldn't understand it, and they didn't believe in God yet, or know God yet. And then when I showed them how to see things clearly, then they did. You know. Maybe some comments on this. Evil rising to the heights of genocide is not resisted by God, so we can have free will. The application of violence was, as far as I know, all that stopped the Nazis. Yeah, I don't have a problem, and I would even appreciate people using violence to protect other people's property. I basically appreciate it, and I'm not saying I wouldn't do it myself, and I may do it, myself. We can maintain a holding pattern that way, and it also, I do think that God will maintain the holding pattern no matter what we do. As far as I can tell, it would be kind of ridiculous for God to let us all get wiped out by Nazis anyway. But that being said, I totally applaud people's actions to help protect others' property and lives and so forth, and stopping genocide. And I think it's perfectly reasonable to kill people to stop them from killing others. It's perfectly reasonable to basically not, and it's perfectly reasonable to do so, in a sense. But it's not reasonable to condemn violence. A number of conservative radio hosts, for example, they'll explicitly condemn violence, or they'll even condemn impoliteness or crudeness when the IRS has the ultimate violence towards us. Government, like they'll say you should be polite and respectful regarding politics. The IRS isn't polite and respectful. They and all people who support them want me, my wife, myself, and you guys thrown in jail, where we'll very possibly be raped, where we'll be killed if we try to escape. Is that polite? So the government doesn't, and regulations, the way it enforces it. When I wanted my wife to come to my house, she wasn't allowed. Thugs from the government prevented her from coming for over a year because they didn't think I made enough money. And they were afraid they themselves would give her welfare, so they wouldn't let her come to my house. They forced her to stay overseas. And they would attack her or people that helped her come over here, like airlines, if she came here. So these people working for the government, these agents and enforcers, and they're violent, and horrifically so. They're not polite. And so the idea of condemning violence to stop them, I think, gives away the game, and I don't get it. I don't get it at all. And any kind of praise of government when it's built on extortion, it's great if people want to go over there and fight the Nazis, but it's not great if FDR is going to use slavery to do it, right? FDR used slavery in order to conscript people for a time. For a time there was conscription for World War II. Or Abraham Lincoln used slavery, and it was horrific. He enslaved people from New York and other places and forced them to go run in front of cannons and kill people. That's not okay. That's horrific, right? So you don't do that, right? The problem with our military now is it's built off of extortion. So that's not okay. But if someone wants to use violence in self-defense, and you use the violence in self-defense against the specific individual, you don't anthropomorphize. Oh, another thing that causes so much evil and suffering in the world, practically speaking, is anthropomorphizing groups so that people can feel like a sense of justice. One of the most horrific instances of this was anthropomorphizing the idea of Japanese, as if Japan is a person, right? And then in doing so, people justify, to this day, both conservatives and liberals, right? The scary part is where people agree, not when they disagree. They both justify incinerating young children, their eyeballs incinerated, their skin incinerated right in front of their parents. Presumably some little tiny children were reaching out to hug their parents, but both were incinerated before each other's eyes. And that only makes sense if you think of Japan itself as a person. that attacked the United States, and that the United States as a person had to attack it back. And part of that person was these 3-year-olds and 2-year-olds, or they could be 30, but if they had nothing to do with what the individuals obeying the emperor were doing, right? They have nothing to do with each other. Projecting the idea, a group on top of them, is the problem. People say religion is the problem. Certain ideas found within religion can be wrong, but anthropomorphizing groups and thinking of a group as a person is horrific. And a lot of conservative, and pretty much everyone that I've ever heard, conservative radio hosts do that. They anthropomorphize groups all the time. And I single out conservative because I feel like I'm more on the side of conservatives than liberals. I prefer conservatives to be oppressing me and leading the mafia-like government than liberals. But either way, yeah, there's all kinds of errors like that. And anthropomorphizing groups is a horrific error. Looking at the United States as if it's a person that needs to decide things. Also, my plan for the world being transformed. Notice it's individual based. I don't say things like, we all need to do this, or enough people need to do this, or we need to spread awareness about X. That's all nonsense. It's a terrible strategy. Anything that involves a group making a decision, or a group doing something moral or immoral, a group isn't an entity, is not conscious. Our minds project and why does this happen? When we look at the world wrong and we look at the physical world as the foundation, then we project consciousness onto physical things. We're like, oh, that body, that human is conscious, but that tree isn't. No, bodies aren't conscious. There's conscious beings that have bodies, but the body isn't conscious. Neither is the brain or the mind. None of those things are conscious. When we start projecting consciousness on those things, then it's natural to project consciousness onto a whole group. And it's horrible. Same thing with this group needs to do a better job policing itself, or this group needs to have better family values, or stop having such a high out-of-wedlock rate. A group can't do jack or squat. The solution never involves a group of people doing anything. So again, my solution is reasonable because it involves individuals only. There's individuals and there's everyone. You split people other than that, and you're doing something counterproductive, generally speaking, especially if you do it, you anthropomorphize. We don't anthropomorphize OMG. When we treat OMGers as individuals, right, we can like OMG as a place. And we treat OMG as a place, which it is, especially once you understand that actual physical places don't exist except as reasons either, right? Then OMG is a legitimate place as well. So we make a place that's OMG. But OMG is not a person. And as a group, we're not a decision-making entity. If individuals in OMG do something good or do something screwed up, then it's not OMG doing it. Individuals do it. And by treating people as individuals is one of our secrets. And one of my secrets is I put that at the foundation of our ideas in OMG, is individuals. It's all built on individuals. I never say phrases like, oh, it's you guys that make this place great. I'll say it's individuals that make this place great. Right? Each of you individuals may make this place great if you're doing so. But again, not anthropomorphizing groups. It's a horrendous, horrendous thing. Okay. Yeah, history is written by the victors, right? Totally original and insightful. Thank you. Excellent. I like that. We got a Mike. Let's make it out of that one, because originality is key, right? To get people to listen to me with a fresh listening. Actually, I thought, what if? Mike was clarifying. What if somebody found an invention much more important than cancer, than the cure for cancer? They would fix things. They would fix everything. Perfect. Exactly. Beautiful, Mike. Sorry if I misrepresented that. But he was a hardened atheist at 29. Age right, cute. The political propagandists regularly create caricatures to absolutely, nonstop with politics is anthropomorphizing groups, nonstop. And getting people to identify with tribes to pit one against the other, for sure. And all sides, many sides do it, all individuals do it. Sides can't do it, right? Individuals do it. Individuals and all sides do it. We remove that mistake, and it's like a house of cards. Things just fall apart. And we can't, if people can stop anthropomorphizing groups, then you can't have all kinds of things. You can't have wars, right? To have a war, you have to anthropomorphize groups. There's no way to get to a war without anthropomorphizing a group. In your opinion, where does this line of thinking stem from when people say, oh, everything, that's actually a great question. And for once, a great question doesn't mean I don't know the answer. All right. Generally, what people mean by that is incorrect. When people say, oh, I think everything happens for a reason. What isn't happening is God's choreographing everything for the greater good. This is important and a great distinction. I actually kind of meant to bring this up, and I would have neglected it without Jay asking this question, or saying this. God is not choreographing everything. So sometimes, actually, okay, as a matter of fact, every contradiction leads to, when mixed with things, can lead to bad. And at the root of all bad is a contradiction. If there is something truly bad, we might mischaracterize an event as bad when it isn't, and we don't need to characterize it that way. But if you experience bad, the only place that bad really exists is in your consciousness field, but then there's a reason for bad, which is rooted in a contradiction. So bad exists as a part of your conscious experience, and you have to kind of believe in bad to help that along. But you have to kind of act as if there's bad in order to kind of experience bad. But I haven't fully actualized that understanding yet, so I'll work on that. But I've really come far. I feel I experience way less bad than I used to. I'm much more consistent good. Sorry. So bad is rooted in a contradiction. When what God does is set a playing field, and God may very well, and I think there are these, but I don't know exactly what they are. There's probably spiritual laws that can help, and prayer and so forth. And certainly with people seeking understanding, having faith that there's good, that there's a good path, there's a way of getting to good, right, fundamentally. Right, as I mentioned in the previous Alchemy, in the Alchemy 2 webinar, or no, the first one, right, you want to have faith that there's the right mountain, that there's the right foundation, the right path, not that you're on the right path. That's not faith. That's wrong. Anyhow, contradiction. The contradiction doesn't exist in your consciousness field. The contradiction exists as a reason, exists in your mind and so forth, but your mind exists as a reason just like everything else for things. So God's not choreographing each event so that it works out for good. God is making it possible. He's upholding it being possible for everything to be good, including us abundantly loving each other. And even if there was no bad, I think it's the case that we can create more and more good. So maximizing good isn't exactly the way it works. We can create good, but we can also, or we can lead good to be created by doing what we do. Sometimes it's a little hard to fully not talk within our general model of things. If you spot me doing that, don't worry. I just understand that we have to talk within the model. Sometimes you can just, if you see a problem, just realize that's all that's happening. But we can lead more good to be created. But sometimes bad things happen by default because it's like a car, if it's not steered, by default, by inertia, it would go in a wrong direction. If Nazi ideas rise up or taxation ideas rise up and people are surrounded with them, by default those get absorbed in someone's mind. If the person doesn't see goodness enough to get all the way out from underneath, understanding the idea that you can't have a legitimate government in the sense that it can legitimize evil actions as being good. If someone doesn't get all the way underneath that, they'll absorb the idea that taxation is okay and good. And by default, so that contradiction will get in their mind. That'll lead to evil, right? Or lead to them supporting evil, or bad things happening. And God didn't choreograph that. That happened by inertia, and so not overcoming contradictions that are there right now. So things do happen for a reason, but the reason could be that God is setting the table for allowing us to have abundance and allowing us to love. sort of the opposite, as I said, of how taxation removes the ability for us to love. Not totally, but with that money, we can't give it in love. We can't use it for love. It's taken from us, and the love is stripped out of it. Even if the government redistributes some of it to people that can do something with it that makes them feel good or survive, the love is stripped out no matter what. Things happen for a reason in that one sense, but not in the sense that God's choreographing everything. And bad things can happen by inertia, but it could have been the case that if you saw good previously early enough, or if someone else did and helped you, or if you do and help someone else, then you could have dissolved the contradiction that led to that bad beforehand. But that doesn't mean you need to feel ashamed or guilty ever. It just means that let's be motivated to seek to understand things so that we can dissolve contradictions and therefore not have them spit out bad stuff. And referring, violence we can't win with violence. Perhaps we can, again, keep going with violence, but it's not going to lead to a win. The win has to come from getting underneath things. Right? You can't SWAT enough. You can't kill enough. You can't get rid of contradictions by killing enough people, which is why God doesn't do it either. I'll click over to the other one as well in a moment. Where do you think we conscious beings exist? In other words, where is here? See, that's the kind of great question. That's the kind of, and once again, nice in the way that I can give a pretty good answer to it. That whole issue of where is it, where are we? It stems from starting with this false idea of the world existing in terms of the physical world and place and residual assumptions about things that work that way. Beings don't need to exist in a place. You have beings that exist, and then conscious fields don't exist in a place either, right? They exist, and that you have a conscious field because you're aware of it. And then reasons exist, and you could say you could use a shorthand like reasons exist in God's mind, right, and so forth. But that's more of a model or a kind of. It's not a perfect explanation, but it's as reasonable as anything else that I can tell you. But you want to start to build your understanding of the world off of conscious field and go from there. And you'll notice you'll get into these paradoxes whenever you stray away from that. But it takes getting used to, and I'm not even perfect at it myself. Who would think? There's another problem of stacking. Lincoln gets embedded as representing freedom or FDR supporting. And then current people argue for things based on those paradigms. That's correct. That's a great point, Mike. You nail it. So God created evil or Satan for a reason. Yeah, and I can't tell you whether that's an entity that's doing things on purpose. I can't get to there myself, but I don't really have certainty or great clarity about that. But God created the world so that we could love and we could have abundance, but that created the potential for waste. God set the table so by default things happen, and then again we have a starter kit. It's just like Porsche built my wife's car, but this is not again a perfect metaphor, but it contains some of the right thing. They didn't mess up by the fact that she has to steer it. I'm certain God did rig things so that we can set off a chain reaction for there to be all good, to get rid of the bad, get rid of the contradictions, even one of us, and then more joining and so forth. The dead bury the dead. Think about that on the flip side. Let the living lift the living. I love that. That's terrific, Leslie. That's awesome. Okay, Dave posted that. I never thought of my body and brain as being my avatar. I now see that is a Hinduism term. I've always referred to it as spiritual essence. Yeah, right. It's a Hindu term. That's correct. But these days it has a more common meaning exactly, so I'm comfortable using it. I only mean it in the sense that it's correct. All these ideas of spiritual and all that, they're all built off of this idea without you necessarily being really aware of it, of starting with the physical world as kind of the basis for existence, and then having ideas like spirits and spirituality and supernatural and all that, and energy and all that built on top of it. But I'm telling you, if you look at the world in terms of conscious beings, your consciousness field basically first, then realize there has to be a you that's conscious, and that's all you are, for starters. And then if you figure out more qualities that you have, great. And you're certainly tied to your mind and body in some way that matters, right? But then you can discover more about that. And then understand the rest of the world in terms of it exists as a reason. And then we have models for things, but the model isn't a model. It's a model that helps us to approximate the reasons that God uses for the world. Even like the idea of atoms and molecules. It's not a model of something that exists physically out there. It's a model that approximates whatever model God is, whatever reasons God has, whatever natural laws God has set that are regular, that are set the table for things. Newtonian physics is a great model, and it works. We can't discover that it's wrong in essence, but we can discover that it's incomplete, or that on a certain level it breaks, right? But the model certainly works on a mass scale. And that's fine. Just like imagining that, I used this example before, it's pretty profound though. You can imagine that Middle Earth, like in Tokyo in Lord of the Rings, or that a computer game world really exists, and that works great until it doesn't. Until you die in that world and you don't want to feel suicidal, or you don't want to just lay there feeling dead, right? So believing that the physical world actually exists works fine until it doesn't. The problem is people don't realize it's a model, and it's not a model. You don't have a representation in your mind of the physical world. You have a model for a model, basically, a model of the reasons God's using. What was the question here? Is it possible we live in a simulation? See, this is where the Matrix got it wrong, and this is where everyone gets it wrong, because they'll always revert every time to this basis of the physical world being either the basis for things or as being something that exists in a way that it doesn't. We don't live in a simulation. We experience a consciousness field, again, that has reasons. It's like a video game, the world in a video game, like I talked about, like if it was taking place in New York City and there was a zombie apocalypse or something in New York City, and we were running around with a gun trying to survive. That would be a simulation in one sense, but it wouldn't be a simulation of anything but itself, in a sense. I don't want to confuse myself or you, but again, if you kind of think about it in that way, we don't live in a simulation of the world. We experience a consciousness field again, and that's the reasons for things. Let's see if anything more. How and why did Jesus receive? So why Jesus, right? Take this a bit as some thoughts I have about it that could be corrected, perhaps. I'm not. But my understanding of what Jesus was trying to accomplish, the standard story is that it's like there's a judge and you're guilty, but the judge doesn't want to sentence you, so instead the judge puts his son in jail because someone has to serve the sentence. Like God just has to hurt somebody, and so God hurt Jesus instead of us, and therefore that allows us to be saved. There's a nonsensicalness to that if you look at it. Like that God just needs to make someone suffer, and so God made Jesus for himself suffer instead of us. I think that Jesus came to illustrate, it all gets to the same place. We want to have a relationship with God, we want to seek goodness, we want to have faith in God, but faith that God has provided us a path to goodness. And then it'll resolve itself as we seek that, and as we care about all people. Right, and all people not achieving their goals, but having, all people can't achieve their goals because they conflict, but all people having enough understanding that they can all be happy, right, and experience goodness. That's what we want. And understanding that God experiences what other people experience is pretty eye-opening. What was I saying here? Oh, so my take on what Jesus was trying to accomplish. Like, obviously Jesus wasn't trying to do what I'm talking about we can do, which is to set and to win, right? If God was trying to win, God would win, right? We're not like better than God or more powerful than God. But I pointed to how God hits too hard, right? So Jesus would hit too hard if Jesus tried to just win. I think what Jesus was doing was illustrating the default, was trying to show in the most extreme and clear way God could that by default something's up. Everybody, with like the exception of Jesus' mother and one of the Marys, or one or both of the Marys, but basically everyone, shouted not just for Jesus, not just didn't defend Jesus, but like shouted for Jesus to be tortured and killed. That should be eye-opening, because that should show the default, and that we should assume that we would be in that same default. Our brains are set up so that we assume, oh no, we wouldn't do that. But how about we assume we would, unless we get out under it? Not just that we put something like a beliefs on top of it to correct that, but get out from under and figure out a way underneath, or a fundamentally different way of seeing the world, so we wouldn't be Nazis if we were raised in Nazi Germany. We wouldn't be taxers in our world. We wouldn't be shouting for Jesus to be tortured and killed back in that world. Because like Jesus came and just healed people and taught wonderful things, and they tortured him to death. And but it wasn't like a few guys. It wasn't like just the government. It was like everybody, practically, except for as I said, a couple of women. Which is a powerful statement against the sexism at the time, right? It's kind of rebounded in maybe the other direction these days in some cultures, where now men are always wrong, or at least in the family. In the business world, maybe women and femininity is defined as wrong there, and then masculinity is kind of defined as wrong in a lot of the social world. But that's just commentary on my part. But I think, interesting. How was God created? God wasn't created. See, and God is not something that I'm postulating or putting as like a magic wand. If you go carefully through what I explained, there's no magic wand. There's no mysterious God as an explanation. There isn't like what I've done instead, if you go back through this, is show what has to be the case. And not just that there has to be a first cause or a prime mover or something, or a watchmaker, or that initially winds the watch. I'm showing you what has to be going on right now and always in order for your consciousness field to be the way it is. And that can only be happening because God is currently, not because of God, but because there has to be a thing, an entity with certain attributes that's doing it. That's what I said. It wasn't that I proved that God exists, or I didn't have to even define God and then show that exists. What I did was show what has to exist, and it's shorthand to say that's God. Obviously, if there's an all-powerful being that's creating everything in our consciousness field, obviously that's the only thing we call God, right? But it wasn't that I defined God and then proved that definition existed. Instead, I showed what has to exist. And then presumably you call it God. You call it I'm not saying this to Shima, but I'm saying this to anyone who would object. Call it whatever you want, but it has to exist. And I showed how. I have to describe this whole talk in some way and to relate to people as they currently see the world. So I have to say I'm showing that God exists, or I'm proving that God exists. But really I'm showing you the way everything has to work fundamentally in existence. And it's off of understanding this that I built my success understanding and how to make money and all that. When you have the right foundation, you can figure all kinds of cool stuff out. So people say, oh, does it matter? A few people ask me, and in a totally constructive way, and not in a snide way, but does it really matter if God exists? What matters is not so much whether God exists. It matters to understand what the heck is going on with your consciousness field, with you, with your basic experience, with whatever you call it, with existence. How are you supposed to figure out how to be happy on a day-to-day basis or do anything if you don't know fundamentally what's going on? People have it so screwed up, thinking that there's this physical world out there, and that's one day consciousness emerged as balls are bouncing around, right? Literally. That's actually how people view the world. Balls are bouncing around. Electrons, protons, neutrons bouncing around. bonking into each other, and one day they bonked each other in just a certain way, and consciousness popped out. And people say, I wonder if computers or machines can become conscious and take over the world. Yeah, if the balls bounce around the right way, or the light wave, or the energy waves bounce around just in the right way, bammo, consciousness fields pop into existence. Where the heck is that? That's the ridiculous. That's just a random leap into nothingness. Fundamentally, thinking and everything in life is about mixing. It's not about, and these just random leaps in haphazard directions, right? Balls bounce around. Consciousness. You have to mix and get what the result is of mixing concepts, or you try to see what the ingredients are to concepts to dissolve them, or to mix the more fundamental ingredients in different ways. And you never want to mix in a clearly wrong or bad ingredient. You can't solve poverty through violence. Give me a freaking break, right? The only thing you can possibly solve with violence is self-defense, something like that. But you can't like make people not be poor by threatening to kill somebody, right? One doesn't lead to the other. You can't mix one and get the other. It's like you can't mix a bunch of nails and get a cake that you can eat. Government can't make people not poor. Obviously, you can shoot some guy, take his stuff, and give it to someone, and then they'll have that stuff. But the ripple effects will be negative if you do that. You're spreading the idea of violence while you're doing it. Right? You're always spreading the implication of what you're doing, in addition to the overt thing. That's the law of implication. The law of implication. One angle on the law of implication is, yeah, the law of attraction is correct, except you need to understand you're attracting. This is still a model. There's no actual attraction or forces. But it's a model that basically works. There's a reasonable approximation. You're attracting the implication of your actions and your thoughts. You're attracting what has to be true. If you shoot someone or threaten to hurt someone and take their money and give it to someone else, then what you're spreading is that we should just threaten, as long as we feel like we feel like it, as long as we can just justify it some way. Right? Oh, we need solar power. Oh, we need to send a rocket to the moon. So let's threaten to hurt people and take their money. Right? Clearly, if you can justify it that way, you can justify it however you want, right? As long as I can feel like a justification, as long as anyone comes up with a justification that they feel good about, they can just hurt someone else or threaten to hurt someone else and take their stuff. That's what you're really spreading when, with taxation and so forth. I agree with you. I say being specific with prayers is important. Don't just pray and answer. I don't disagree. I don't have necessarily a lot to say about that. I wish I understood prayer better. Plain speech, David Mills, thank you. Sean, mostly it's the stuff we're talking about. I explained this to Michael Long. I don't remember how long ago, 15 years ago, was it Mike? Or 29. Wow, Mike's not that old. 11 years ago or so. I explained this to Mike. I didn't have it as clear, but I was clear enough that it worked for Mike. Just great. That's great. I had no idea, David. Dang, man, I'm glad you made it through. Thank you. That puts a finer perspective, the idea of lazy thinking being dangerous, solid stuff. Appreciate that. I think it's just so important to seek. Absolutely right. Absolutely right. Your teaching has challenged some of my norms, and I love that. That's some of what you shared made me cry from the sheer power of it. Oh, that's wonderful. I'm no good at crying myself in most cases. You know when I cried recently? Did I tell anyone this? I felt like Fletch for a moment. It was Star Wars. I was watching The Force Awakens. I only saw it recently. And that scene with maybe because I have a 3-year-old son about the same age, or 4 now. But when that scene where Rey, with parents were leaving and had to leave, and she was there, and she was hysterical for them to come back, that got me. But that's about the only thing that's gotten me. Sometimes in the past, pretty often reading about Jesus has done the same thing, but unfortunately most OMG stories, no matter how touching, they don't tend to do it for me. I mean, they touch me greatly, but not actual tears. When I say my soul is consciousness, I wouldn't say that, not because it's wrong, but because it just doesn't get you, like it's just kind of blurry, or what I call chunking up. We don't need to, what you mean by that might be correct. My soul being consciousness, again, I would say that I clearly have a consciousness field. Off of that, I build that there has to be a me that's conscious. if I'm going to suppose that I have any other qualities other than that I'm conscious of my consciousness field, I need to discover those properly. I can't just glom them on or magically attach them to myself and say, oh, I have this on that. I don't assume if my, what I think people are getting at when they say soul would be a mind, right, something that stores your model for the world or something about you and what you've done and memories apart from your brain. So that if you physically die, there's still some mind that's left, some storage mechanism or something that might live on. I do suppose that's the case. Another, I suppose, heretical view I might have. But interestingly enough, this view, as I can see it, is only helpful. I don't see any problems coming from it. If someone were to show me how it's wrong, I have no problem with that. I'm not trying to impose it upon people. But as far as I can tell, it's totally reasonable to suppose that we actually, our soul lives on and we actually could have multiple lives on Earth. I'm not saying that's the case, but I don't see how it necessarily is not the case, and I don't see how anything Jesus said necessarily conflicts with that, and maybe even hints at that, perhaps. But again, I'm open either way. But interestingly, it has all kinds of constructive things, and it explains there's a lot of problems with thinking that people have one life on Earth, and then there's a judgment, and then they're screwed or not, or something, or we have one life on Earth, and then we're all in paradise. A lot of those don't make sense if you think them through. And then what happens if a 2-month-old dies? It's either, you have to answer either bliss, limbo, like nothingness, hell. I mean, you know, come on. God's going to torture a 2-month-old infant forever? No, right? I mean, that's just beyond ridiculous. If it's going to just go to heaven in some way that we're all trying to get there, then it seems like you just might as well kill everything when it's 2, right? If you assure it's going to heaven when it's 2 months old, but then if it lives to 12, then it could screw up and something bad would happen. It doesn't make any sense. So it seems like more like something where, and this is why I think we can maybe get to everybody. You know, maybe they die now, but we get to them later. But again, I'm not trying to impose this on anyone. I don't say that it's true necessarily, but I don't see how it's necessarily not true. And boy, we'd be a lot more, practically speaking, we wouldn't be so screwed up to people in other cults, other tribes, right? If we could be reborn into that tribe later, we wouldn't be so obsessed with our own. So people might behave differently, right, about the world if we might be on this for longer than we expect. So just interesting, just food for thought. How about the idea? How about the idea that God is doing introspection? There's certain things about the future, like people tend to think that God has things figured out, and maybe a way like in some ways God doesn't, which is kind of weird to say. But I showed you how God can't know the future. If the future is inherently infinite, it can't all exist. God can't be looking at it all right now, right? Also, if it existed, then things would be determined, right? And people try to wiggle out of that. So I'm quite certain, like one thing I am comfortable saying is that God isn't aware of the future, and the future is not determined in the way that some people claim that it is. And that's kind of different than God may have to mix things together, but it's, in a sense, conceptually. Remember, things exist as reasons. They don't exist in reality. Reality is consciousness fields. Think about that. The basis for reality is consciousness fields. That's where that's where reality takes place. The rest is just reasons. It's just like ideological. So God can mix concepts to see what happens. God could presumably do that instantly and perfectly. But that would be a type of God doing introspection or something, is God mixing concepts. Safe to say that even this world can be considered arbitrary, and our only power in the world is to be able to reason out our way through it. Does that mean, when I say safe to say, does that mean I am assuming that I know, given that I feel that I know? Also, I'm confused about consciousness field. Does it have a fixed radius? Okay. I don't yet understand all that. I probably could if I'm stuck with it, but let me start with something I do get. The idea of your consciousness field, if you try to pin it down, it's going to keep slipping through your fingers in a sense. I mean, how big is it? What exactly is in it right now? If I'm looking at my lawn, it looks like I'm aware of all the blades of grass, but yet I, in another sense, clearly not, aware of all the blades of grass. Things like that. What exactly do I know? What do I just think I know? Instead, you need to back into the concept by disproving the opposite in this case. So your basis for not knowing and experiencing the world can't be outside of your consciousness field, right? Your conscious field is the only place where your goodness and badness of experience can be. It's the only foundational place where your knowledge has to be based. Somewhere regarding your conscious field is a foothold for your knowledge, and it's also where good and bad exists. It can't exist outside of it for you. Because then, again, by logic, it would be outside of your experience. Your own goodness, your own can't, when I say goodness, I don't mean morality. I mean your own feeling of goodness, right? When I say goodness, I mean your experience of goodness is goodness. That can't, good ideas would be reasons for goodness. Good ideas, depending on how you define terms, but a good idea, again, as I'm defining it right now, is not inherently good. It's a reason for goodness, and then goodness resides in your consciousness field. We couldn't say goodness for yourself resides outside of it. So again, if you try to pin down your consciousness field exactly what's in it, you're going to have an issue. But when you back into it by realizing the opposite can't be the case, then that's going to lead you in the right direction. Is it all relative, thought, conscious field? Probably not, depending on what you mean. Consciousness, your consciousness field is the way it is. That's not relative. That's objectively true for all people. I'm not aware of your consciousness field, but right now it's configured in a certain way. That's objectively true, and that's the objective basis for reality, is your consciousness field, everyone else isn't God's. That's objectively real. The reasons that God's aware of are objectively real as reasons. They're not real as hard molecules bouncing around, but they're real as reasons. Everything is real as a conscious experience, as a conscious being, or as a reason why you have the conscious experience you do. Everything exists as one of those things. Trying to figure out how it exists outside of those things, you're probably going to run into dead ends, unless you notice a category I haven't mentioned or something like that. But that's going to get you on the right track. Even if you figure something out I haven't talked about there, it's probably going to be along those lines or based on that, or having more clarity, not showing why that's wrong, presumably. But if you do, then I'll learn something. But it's very important to understand that truth is not relative. There's plenty of things that are relative, like is somebody tall, right? I mean, relative to what? Or what you're experiencing in your consciousness field, like time, you can have a relativeness, like what are you experiencing relative to me while I'm experiencing something, what are you experiencing? But truth in general isn't relative. So God is conscious awareness. No, God's an entity that is conscious. God is not the consciousness itself. God is not consciousness. God is not love. God is not awareness. God is an entity that has qualities that we can figure out. We can almost figure out more about God than about ourselves, interestingly enough. Because God, things have to be true about God. We're more like whimsical. So God's an entity that has unlimited, and is the only entity that can cause conscious fields to be the way that they are. God loves us in the sense that God wants max goodness for all of us. And but God is conscious and aware and intentional. Because if you try to imagine this entity that makes our consciousness fields, and then imagine it not being intentional, that's a contradiction in terms. It's like trying to imagine a married bachelor. The closer or more aware one is of consciousness, the closer one is to God. All of that, it's like when I mentioned if I give you like blue paint and you already have like a bucket of paint that you're going to pour it into, you're kind of like trying to pour what I'm talking about into an existing view of the world, and it's muddling you up there, Aqua. So you want to try to take what I'm saying and just build off of that without projecting some of this stuff. You don't get closer to God. Your understanding that's in your mind, which isn't you, can get cleared up. You, by seeking understanding, can lead to more good that's presumably going to be in your mind, could be in a mind separate from your brain, like a soul as well. But one way or the other, see, you need to be able to do something, otherwise you wouldn't suffer. If you didn't have free will, you wouldn't suffer. Like God has to have given you power to do something, because God wouldn't just make people suffer for no reason, without there being something you could do to have goodness. So you have to have power. You use that power, and your mind will have more good ideas and less bad ideas. Bad ideas defined as things that are inherently contradictory, that become reasons for bad experience in your consciousness field. But you don't try to get closer to God. You try to have more understanding of what's good and true, which you have to build in the way that I'm showing you. David, you said Jesus is God, so Jesus was completely conscious and aware. I don't know the differences between God as the entity that I've shown has to exist and Jesus. I don't know exactly. Jesus had different qualities than a normal person, it would seem. And in some way it seems like Jesus was God's avatar. I don't know exactly about that. Individually, and I would suppose from what Jesus seemed to say that Jesus was not aware of everything in that way. But also that Jesus wasn't. I would affirm that Jesus was not fallible, as far as I can tell. And I believe as if Jesus was not fallible. I studied Jesus' word trying to understand what Jesus meant, as if Jesus was infallible. But I don't treat my impression, no matter how strongly I feel, of what Jesus has said as infallible. If I felt like Jesus told me to condemn somebody or hurt somebody, then I wouldn't do so just because I thought so. I thought that's what Jesus meant. Individually, we all find total consciousness and become one in my ideal thinking mind. I wouldn't quite put it that way. There might be a way to interpret what you're saying that actually is correct. But I'm looking to, I really think in terms of the word understanding, not consciousness. I don't try to become more conscious. I don't tell other people to become more conscious. I don't tell people to join their consciousness into one. I would say seek understanding. Everything will work itself out. And you want to try to understand ideas correctly so that that leads to goodness. It appears that the penalty system is a principle of some kind. Does the law of implication and compass address this structure? Jesus in the substitute penalty thought. Yeah, see, what I think leads to bad are contradictions. I think we have the ability to resolve those contradictions as we're not deceived. The only contradictions I would say, oh, this is interesting. I would say the default situation is bliss. Bad comes about from that bliss being blocked. That block comes from the manifestation of contradictions in ideas. As we dissolve those, we dissolve blocks. And that's also related to us being able to love other people. We can, by default, we will love other people, but it's only by being deceived and blocked by incorrect ideas that we wouldn't. Yet that ability to seek understanding lets us participate in love and goodness in a way that apparently is abundant and better than if God had just stuck us in this default state of bliss. Interestingly enough, when people make computer games, they don't just make a game where everything's fine. You're just sitting there in a chair and everything's like super duper, right? There's always problems that you have to deal with. A little bit of indication that somehow that's better. We're better off in that situation than if we were just in this blissful situation. So how do we translate this into $1 million a month? I'll keep going with alchemy, and I'll work on that with you. That's why I did this one as an aside, as a bonus. But it'll all relate. OMGers make me cry right and left. Yes, Mike. Tears abound in 64 directions. Handkerchief. This has been fascinating. I think you would find Kabbalah interesting. I think I would. I've looked at it a little bit, but haven't looked at it recently. Thanks for taking the time to share your ideas. Yeah, virtual reality headsets, but even computer games and computers really show us something about reality and so forth that can kind of help wake us up. And I think the world is full. I think God's packed the world with metaphors to help us figure out what's going on, especially like having kids and all that. Marriage, all of it is like metaphors to help us get a sense of what's going on in our relationship with God. It's probably getting a little bit long in the tooth here. You bring up so many things I haven't really considered in what seems like a long time. Thank you for the perspective. You're welcome. Ideally, you wouldn't quite think of it as a perspective. You would think of it as getting beneath perspectives. When I talk about your consciousness field actually, by starting your own understanding of the world there, you're getting beneath perspectives. Perspectives form part of the reason why you experience your consciousness field. But your consciousness field itself, when you build from that, that might be a little confusing. But I'm not giving you a lens through which to see the world so much as I'm trying to show you how to see the world beneath lenses. Every filter of my body argues there is no God, especially, oh my gosh, I'm so sorry, Andrea. How do you find happiness, faith after that? You can, and it's triangulation. There's nothing underneath your feelings. They're just a lot of, there's just a lot of justifications or things that seem to lead to a conclusion, but underneath those things, it's like a table with legs, but the legs aren't resting on anything. It doesn't matter how many legs you have under a table. If those legs themselves, even if those legs are on a floor, but that floor is on nothing. If you would build off of what I'm showing you, you'll get there. But I'm so sorry, Andrea, that you have to go through that. What do I think is happening with the prayer, "Thy will be done"? Just random point, but I don't pray in Old English. I just pray like kind of speak normally. Not that it matters, but just how I do it. How is God bringing that about? Again, I think that it's blocks, and maybe that's a good way to help unblock things. I'll try to think about that and give a better answer in the future. Great. On the underlying, not now, but I'll keep that in mind. Michael, I like that. Good question. Thank you, Casey, for posting that. I'm winding down here. I'm just kind of looking through a little bit. My husband just can't understand why there's even a need for God. This webinar, hopefully I tried to explain it, that when you have a consciousness field, either the configuration of your consciousness field happens for no reason whatsoever, which means you can't live off that. You have to assume everything that you experience happens for literally no reason. Meaning that if you think someone punched you in the face, you experience that. It has no connection with anything external or any reason. Or there has to be a reason, and as you start to develop that reason, I showed you with the idea of limited, unlimited, and causal power and how that works and reasons, and then I narrowed down what has to exist. So that's why there's a need, so to speak. Is there a psychological need? Well, that's not relevant. I mean, a psychological need is just based on the starter kit, on your whatever is programmed into your mind currently. It's just triangulation based on nothing. And then, of course, there's a need to seek understanding until and unless all bad is eradicated from the world for everybody. Then, of course, you want to seek understanding about important things, right? So there's a need. The only reason you wouldn't have a need is if someone dumbs down their desires for life and is perfectly happy with badness for either themselves or other people or both. If you're okay with bad in any way, shape, or form, you are allowing evil. You are encouraging evil. Never, ever, ever be okay with bad in any way, shape, or form. It doesn't mean you have to get angry. You don't need more bad to overcome the bad. But to say that to respond to bad in a way where you don't want to seek understanding is what I'm talking about, is opening the door to evil. It's a real problem. Maybe he hasn't been married long enough. Oh my God, that's really funny. It's true. Haven't watched the replay. Love it, John. Go, John. It's the whole defense against the defense. Excellent. But at least we know what's going on. So we have a foothold ourselves. We can go. And yeah, just don't be in a rush. Don't be in a rush. We'll get there. Some people will have to surround. We'll have to get a whole bunch of other people that they know and respect, understanding things first. So it may take some time, but I'm relentless as hell. And I think a lot of you guys are too. So let's do this. I tried to explain about why evil exists, is that for God to stamp out, God hits too hard. God either just has us in a situation with all goodness, all bliss, or he sets the table in a way where there's blocks that we're able to dissolve by seeking understanding. There's contradictions and we can dissolve them. And somehow by participating in that process of dissolving these blocks, we're going to be better off. We're going to have more goodness. We're going to be able to say we cared, we loved, and that's going to be better. So that's the answer. I think some of these things, God doesn't murder conscious beings, right? You're talking about a body dying, and I already said that it's totally plausible that people have multiple lives in some way, shape, or form. So it's not the end of the world, so to speak. But I agree. Anytime, if anyone's suffering, none of that is going to be need to be necessarily permanent. So any kind of belief system where people are going to permanently suffer and God is going to sit there with people permanently suffering, I don't see that. Maybe they'll permanently lock themselves out in some way, but I don't even see that. I don't see how God wouldn't make them suffer at that point. They'd have to be just bringing it upon themselves unnecessarily. Anyway, I'll worry about that once I'm done. Until then, I'm going for everyone being having max goodness and getting rid of contradictions for everybody. The model is unique. The model, it's based on the physical world, the reality. The physical world exists as reasons, but there's a reality of it, just like there's a reality for other things. That's objective, and it's not unique to individuals. The model, your mind, the model you might have of the world, that can be unique to you, but it's based on something objective, but it's not based on something foundational. The physical world is not foundational. And it doesn't exist as people think it does, but it's objective and real. It's not real foundationally as people think. Just like people's thoughts and beliefs aren't real. Just like if you feel like you don't want to wake up in the morning, or if you feel like somebody's a jerk, that's not real in the way that people think it is often. People often think that it's true, like it has an objective reality to it, or there's a basis for it that at least has a lot of validity. That doesn't necessarily have any basis. It's not real in the way people think. Hopefully that helped a little bit. I'm a little bit, again, kind of summing up here. I come right over my dogma here. Where there'll be a replay, for sure. And check the group more often, check the news more often. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I have some things I could say about that. I don't want to be too confusing, but yeah, what you just said about no one being good except the Father could be totally valid, of course. And also, we try to understand what Jesus meant. Jesus said things so we could break our normal way of seeing things and understand things. We could stop calling people good and stop being okay. It's not it's also not your mind or your body that's good, right? Okay. All right, I will wind things up here for this recording. We'll always be talking about things in Alchemy, developing understanding of things more. I'll be talking in Alchemy next, something to do with flexibility with goals. It'll be very helpful. And then I'm actually going to want to start applying things to how to develop a marketing plan for yourself and things like that for a little while. So I'll try to go back and forth with some kind of practical money-making stuff that's based on some of the deeper stuff I'm talking about, and that can also help to illustrate it better. And then maybe look to get quote-unquote deep again and so forth. And Mike means with this, he means stories. There's some really touching stories of success and things people have dealt with and worked through that are very touching. And then feeling a part of that is very touching for Mike and myself. Okay, guys, thank you so much for participating. It was really encouraging to have so many people on this and such great questions and encouraging comments. Thank you. Thank each of you that participated. Great, and I'm not picking on Shirley at all, but in addition to absorbing it, which is a perfectly reasonable thing to say, try to let it break your starter kit, your previous understanding of the world, to the extent that it was wrong, and break out of it so you can be in a different playing field where things are different and make different kind of sense. You know, try to let what I say break your previous understanding of the world, or at least be built in parallel until it's built up to the point where it can take over or at least clear up some things. Thanks, Scott. You're very welcome. ETA recording, that's very nice. I might be able to get it up tonight. I'll see if I can get it all processed. And certainly tomorrow, if not tonight. You're welcome, Scott. Is there a good place to ask LOI questions? Probably on the Alchemy webinars is a good place, and including in on the Facebook group, of course, there. And I try to consider the questions people ask me if I don't get to them, and then I often get to a lot of the questions. So I'd say on the Alchemy webinars, and I'll be doing a lot of those over time. So hopefully get to things. Appreciate you touching such a deep subject. Yeah, it's not easy, in a sense, right? It's hard, and except that it's kind of the reason why we did this, so it's less scary that way. But it's not easy. We're all these rules, right? That we're supposed to not talk about this stuff, but we have to do it. You're very welcome, Jay, and Cheryl, and of course each person. Do I want questions ahead of time? Oh, totally appropriate. You can put questions once I post. I have to post this for tomorrow. I'll have to post another thing. It might be not until tonight that I do that. I'm not sure. Or tomorrow morning is what I meant to say. But whenever you see an Alchemy webinar post, you can certainly post some questions. Totally welcome. Thank you, Dave. Absolutely. You're welcome, Sean. And, of course, each person if I don't mention you. All righty. You guys are so great. I will end the recording just about now.